Chapter 244. The dense forest was still somewhat damp, most likely the earliest storm last night had ravaged this part of the forest, everywhere was wet. Behind him, the already dead Kunlun disciple was lying in the dirty water. The air began to fill with a strong smell of blood, but it did not come from a dead body. That dim light in the depths of the forest seemed to be slowly approaching. Because the sky was dark, the forest was too dark, and there were many trees blocking the view, so Lu Chen could not see clearly what it was. He could only vaguely see that it was a huge monster, but it did not look like a human, so most likely it was a demon beast. Lu Chen's heart sank. He suddenly thought that during this escape, especially after entering this part of the forest, he did not see a single demon beast. This was obviously not right. And from the sharp breath coming from the front, he was afraid that the demon beast that suddenly appeared was not a good one. Bloodthirsty and violent was unavoidable. Encountering this kind of thing, the best way was of course not to take it head-on, not to mention that Lu Chen's current situation was not much different from a lamp that had run out of oil. He was just short of collapsing with one touch. To be honest, with his experience these few days, not to mention ordinary people, even if it was a normal cultivator, not many people would be able to withstand it. Lu Chen tried his best to calm his breathing, and then began to slowly retreat. In the process of retreating, he did not even dare to turn his back to the dim light in the dense forest, because his past experience had long made him know that if he still showed his back when encountering a powerful demon beast, it was equivalent to shouting to the demon beast to quickly come and eat him. It was just that in these few days, his luck seemed to be extremely bad. He had only retreated 3 or 4 steps when suddenly a gust of cold wind came from the forest behind him. Lu Chen's expression changed. He looked back and saw that in the forest, 2 figures slowly appeared. Both were dressed in black from head to toe, their faces were covered with a black cloth. One was holding a long sword, the other was holding a strange weapon like a flying ring. Looking at their attire, coupled with their undisguised murderous aura, as well as the deep-seated hatred in their eyes, it was 100 times stronger than the Kunlun disciple. They were obviously from the Three Realms demonic sect. Lu Chen sighed. After hesitating for a moment, he still slowly turned around, facing the 2 demonic sect disciples, giving his back to the mysterious demon beast in the forest. Sometimes, humans were actually much more terrifying than demon beasts. Traitor! An angry roar filled with disdain and hatred came from the masked man in black. The 2 men did not have the slightest thought of tolerating Lu Chen's breathing or understanding that he was seriously injured and at the end of his rope. Without hesitation, they launched an attack. Their weapons flashed with a cold light as they fiercely slashed at Lu Chen. It looked like they wanted to immediately cut Lu Chen into pieces. The sword wielder charged straight into the middle of the door, while the person holding the strange flying ring weapon suddenly split into 2 in midair after activating his weapon. He split into 2 and circled around to both sides, actually forming a pincer attack with the other person. The killing situation was set in an instant, without the slightest thought of tolerating Lu Chen's mercy. Lu Chen's breathing became heavier, his eyes cold. Suddenly the veins on his neck bulged, his entire body looked as if it was about to collapse in the wind. Without knowing where the strength came from, he suddenly shot forward, completely disregarding the 2 flying rings flashing with cold light behind him, directly pouncing towards the sword-wielding man in black. That man in black seemed to be taken aback, but he had no intention of retreating. Instead he gave a hideous laugh. The sword in his hand became even more intense, directly chopping over. Anyone could see that right now, Lu Chen's entire body was covered in injuries. The situation was terrible. Right now it was just a deathbed struggle. Lu Chen's hurried leap caused him to temporarily pull some distance away from the flying rings behind him. However, the swift and fierce sword light in front of him abruptly closed in. In an instant, it was already right in front of him. Lu Chen's pupils even reflected the shadow of the sword light, but it suddenly disappeared right after. Because all the light in his eyes was suddenly swallowed up by a ball of dark flames. The black flame ignited. Although it was already somewhat dim, the murderous aura did not weaken in the slightest. Darkness surged around Lu Chen, causing his figure to seem to blur for a moment in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. Pooh! A muffled sound, just as the sword light chopped in front of Lu Chen, the darkness still silently surged over the blade, flipped over the sword hilt, and wrapped around that black-clothed man's palm. Ah! The black-clothed man who had been brimming with killing intent suddenly howled loudly, as if he had suffered unimaginable pain in that instant. Even his voice was so sharp that it seemed to have deformed, causing the other black-clothed man not far away to jump in fright. The black flames burned on his hand, directly burning into the flesh. The long sword fell to the ground with a bang sound, an icy but familiar cold energy gathered from his wrist, once again merging into Lu Chen's dantian. As if bitten by the world's most terrifying venomous snake, that black-clothed man fell to the ground and began to struggle with all his might, but at this time the two flying rings were already chasing after him again. Lu Chen's body swayed, as if he wanted to dodge, but his body staggered, unexpectedly not dodging. Pu-pu sound, the two flying rings directly pierced into his back. Lu Chen's vision darkened, and he could no longer support himself. Staggering forward a few steps, his legs softened, and he knelt on the ground, using his hands to support himself, as if he wanted to force himself to stand up again, but no matter how hard he tried, he did not have the strength to support his body. Instead, he forced his body several times, causing several wounds to open up, and blood flowed out. But the blood was not too much, not because the wounds were not deep enough, but because he had already lost too much blood. Finally, there was still no way out. Lu Chen only felt that his vision darkened, his entire body felt like it was about to fall apart, and the remaining traces of strength were quickly dissipating, and everything that he saw at this moment, the night, the forest, the trees, the shadows, the black-clothed, and that strange dim light, suddenly blurred and began to spin. All the sounds seemed to be fading away. The pain was like a tide from every corner of his body, making him feel like he was in the terrifying purgatory of the 9 netherworlds. This was a pain that was enough to make an ordinary person collapse in an instant, but Lu Chen felt a strange sense of familiarity. In the past 10 years, every time the black fire curse flared up, and the black flames burned his body, he would be immersed in this terrible pain, unable to extricate himself. Now, because he was about to die, was the black fire finally beginning to bite back? The black-clothed man with the flying rings glanced at his comrade who was obviously already twitching on the ground, and fiercely rushed up to kick Lu Chen. Lu Chen fell to the ground with a bang, dirty and wet soil splashing on his face. The black-clothed man cursed, his eyes revealing a fierce light, and with a wave of his hands, the two flying rings flew out of his body and back into his hands, bringing with it a flower of blood. At this moment, Lu Chen didn't even seem to have the strength to struggle, only moving his body slightly. The black-clothed man walked forward, and without saying a word, he swiped at Lu Chen's throat. It seemed that he didn't want to drag things out any longer, and wanted to kill directly for revenge. But at this moment, the forest suddenly darkened. The black-clothed man's hand subconsciously slowed, only to see a shadow suddenly surge from the front, flying into the air, filled with murderous intent, especially an unimaginably thick smell of blood. In the darkness, 2 dark green and cold lights swept past, like eerie but transparent gems, and also like the coldest ghost fire in the depths of the yellow springs, surging forward. The name of a huge monster blocked the black-clothed man's vision, leaving him with only darkness. The black-clothed man screamed, his heart was torn apart, but in front of such a terrifying beast, and a sudden sneak attack, he even lost the strength to fight back, and could only subconsciously reach out to cover his head. A fishy wind swept past, and the black-clothed man's body trembled, his whole body cold, but in the next moment, he suddenly froze, only to find that he didn't seem to be injured. Looking up, he saw that the incomparably ferocious and terrifying monster that pounced from the darkness, that momentum like a mountain, actually pounced on empty air. In the dark mountain forest, a huge demonic beast appeared. It was shaped like a wolf, and its body was completely black. Its 2 huge eyes flickered with a cold and dark green light. It looked like a demonic wolf that had walked out from hell. But just now, that seemingly thunderous and murderous attack, this black wolf did not know why, after falling, it actually pounced a foot away from the black-clothed man, pouncing on empty air. The black wolf beast seemed to be a bit stunned. After a moment, it suddenly roared, looking a bit angry. Its two eyes shone with green light. It turned around and slapped the black-clothed man with its claws. Immediately, the black-clothed man's blood spurted out. Before he could react, the ferocious and terrifying beast had already pounced on him and knocked him to the ground. Then with a terrible roar and the sound of flesh tearing, the black-clothed man screamed a few times, and then there was no more sound. In the air of the forest, there was a bit of a bloody smell. Everything slowly quieted down. The black wolf stared at the dead man on the ground a few times, then turned around and walked to the side of Lu Chen, its two eyes flashing with cold light. A terrible wolf mouth that was still dripping blood came over, as if it wanted to make a move on Lu Chen. Lu Chen's body moved a bit, then slowly turned over, still lying on the ground powerlessly. Facing the sky, he gasped for breath. The terrible wolf face appeared in his line of sight, especially the pair of snow-white sharp fangs that protruded out of the mouth, seemed to be colder and sharper than all the blades in this world. Lu Chen quietly looked at this black wolf, suddenly laughed. His laughter was not loud. When he laughed, it also seemed to be very painful, but in his laughter, there was a trace of warmth and gratification, mixed with a little pain. It was like in this dark and cold night, he finally came into contact with a trace of warm light. Lu Chen coughed, with a trace of pain, but he smiled at this fierce monster and said, "Hey, stupid dog, I saw your stupid look just now." Ho! The black wolf monster roared, bared its teeth, and its hair stood up. It seemed to be instantly enraged, wanting to bite this man's throat in one bite. Chapter 245. Black Wolf stared fiercely at the man who looked like he was about to die. He bared his fangs, as if he was considering whether he should bite off this fellow's neck and silence him. Lu Chen was still smiling. He barely raised his right hand and patted Black Wolf's face. "Let's go. I don't know how many pursuers are behind us." Hei Lang growled in a low voice. He still looked a little dissatisfied, but his eyes quickly softened. The original coldness was gone, replaced by a hint of concern and anxiety. It lowered its huge head and extended it to Lu Chen's side, as if it wanted to push him up. However, Lu Chen struggled twice but was still unable to get up. Seeing that Lu Chen seemed to be at the end of his rope, Black Wolf panicked. He whimpered and used his head to gently nudge Lu Chen's body. Then, he lay down beside him, probably urging him to climb onto his back. Lu Chen lay sprawled on the ground, panting heavily. His face was frighteningly pale. He looked like an exhausted dead dog. Black Wolf waited for a while. Seeing that Lu Chen was still motionless, he could not help but let out a low growl. After hesitating for a moment, Black Dragon suddenly stood up and bit towards Lu Chen. He bit the upper part of Lu Chen's arm and suddenly flung it. With a whoosh, a huge force came over. Lu Chen's entire body was involuntarily flung up. At the same time, several wounds on his body burst open again, causing Lu Chen to let out a muffled groan. The muscles on his face twisted, and in the next moment, his entire body was lying on Black Wolf's broad back. The soft but tough black fur carried a trace of warmth. In this cold night, there was a reassuring warmth. Black Wolf looked back at him, as if he was worried. Lu Chen panted for a moment. Even though there was blood at the corner of his mouth, he still laughed softly and said, "Well done. You can go now." The Black Wolf growled in a low voice before turning around and walking away. The forest in front of him was deep, and the shadows of the mountains were heavy in the distance. It had only taken 2 steps when Lu Chen, who was on its back, suddenly whispered, "Don't go back. Kunlun Mountain can no longer accommodate us." Hei Lang's footsteps came to a halt. Its eyes were filled with doubt, but it did not question Lu Chen's words. However, it still howled at the majestic mountain in the distance, as if it was pointing at something. Lu Chen suddenly became silent. He lay on Black Wolf's back, his head buried deep, his hands hanging weakly by Black Wolf's side. There was a hint of indifference in the air. Black Wolf seemed to be a little uneasy, and kept turning his head to look at Lu Chen. After a while, Lu Chen said in a low voice, "There's no need to look for Exin, she dead." Roar! A terrifying howl suddenly burst forth from the black wolf's mouth. A dark green and cold flame instantly appeared in its huge eyes that had recovered. It was like a burning flame. It suddenly raised its head and stared at the deep night and the distant mountain in front of it. Killing intent was like a tide, emanating from the giant beast, as if it wanted to tear everything in front of it to shreds. It suddenly took a step forward, as if it was about to rush into the darkness in the distance. A hand covered in blood gently blocked its path. A moment later, Lu Chen's voice sounded in Black Wolf's ears. It seemed to carry a trace of calmness. "There's no need to go. I've already avenged her." He Lang's front foot paused in midair, and after a while, it slowly retracted it. It turned its huge wolf head and stared at Lu Chen with its terrifying green and murderous eyes. Lu Chen had no intention of avoiding it, and only nodded lightly at the giant wolf. The dark green flame slowly calmed down and was replaced by an indescribable deep sorrow. The huge black wolf was silent. It stood where it was for a long time. It was as if many scenes from the past flashed past its eyes. In the valley of the land of chaos, there was a girl who was smiling like a flower. She hugged it and pouted her lips carefully. Her warm embrace, her kind smile, and her long-winded nagging. She was always smiling, she was always gentle, and she was always a little stupid. Even when they broke up, she would go the wrong way, but the night was so cold, the world was so cruel, and when the lives that should have died finally struggled to survive in her hands, the light fell on their hearts. He Lang carried Lu Chen on its back, slowly turned around, and walked in another direction, towards the south where its back was facing the tall mountain. The mountain forest was silent, and darkness and silence shrouded the surroundings. Lu Chen silently lay on its back, one man and one wolf, gradually walking away. But, just as they were about to walk into the darkness, suddenly, that black wolf turned around, its huge eyes wide open, staring at the dark world, and let out an incomparably mournful howl. The howl spread far away, reverberating between the heaven and earth, reverberating in the night wind, and gradually fading away, as if it was a memory of the past. Then, they finally walked into the darkness, disappearing into the distance. On the majestic Kunlun mountain, it was now deep in the night. On the heavenly Kun peak, in the solemn and majestic Xinyang Hall, Daoist Qian Deng finished his last task, and stood up from the spacious main seat. The chair was extremely spacious and looked very imposing. The wood used to make it was the extremely rare, blood-winged sandalwood. It was a four-veined top-grade spirit wood and was priceless. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was one of the most precious chairs in the world. Only a famous sect like the Kunlun party, which had been passed down for 5,000 years and had never been severed, could possibly have such a profound heritage in such a treasure. As the highly respected Yuanying spiritual master of the Kunlun party, Daoist Qian Deng naturally knew the origin of this blood-winged sandalwood throne, and also knew that in the long years of the past, only the spiritual masters of the Kunlun party had the qualifications to sit on this chair. He had wanted to sit on this chair for a very, very long time. But today, when he really sat on it, he didn't feel particularly comfortable. The chair seemed a bit too hard. Although the blood-winged sandalwood was a top-grade spiritual wood, and could nourish spiritual power and calm the mind, this kind of spiritual wood naturally carried a different kind of strange smell. It wasn't a fishy smell, but a very strange smell. Some people liked it, and some people hated it. Daoist Qian Deng didn't like this smell, so he didn't like this chair either. But he liked the feeling of sitting on this chair very much. So when he stood up, he couldn't help but gently stroke the armrest next to him. He then revealed a satisfied smile, turned around, and walked into the rear hall of Xinyang Hall. Although the night was dark, the side hall behind Xinyang Hall was still brightly lit. But at this time, the many revered Yuanying spiritual masters that gathered in the hall had all disappeared. When Daoist Qian Deng walked into the hall, he only saw two people. One was the bald fatty true Lord Tianlan, who was sitting in the seat of honor, and the other was Zhuo Xian, who was standing respectfully to his side. Daoist Qian Deng glanced at Zhuo Xian indifferently with a hint of disdain in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared and was replaced with a respectful and warm expression. He walked up to True Lord Tianlan and bowed, saying, "Uncle Master, I've come." True Lord Tianlan opened his eyes and looked at Daoist Qian Deng. He smiled and said, "Qian Deng, you've come. Sit down and talk." "Yes." Daoist Qian Deng thanked him and immediately sat down on the left side of True Lord Tianlan. This chair gave him a very familiar and comfortable feeling, especially when compared to the blood-winged sandalwood throne from before. This chair had been placed in this hall for many years, and he had also sat on it for many years. It had always been a position above everyone else and below only one person. For some reason, when he sat here tonight, there was a strange feeling in his heart. It was as if he felt that something was different from before. This subtle emotion flashed through Daoist Master Qian Deng's mind, but he didn't show it on his face. At the same time, Daoist Master Tianlan's voice sounded in his ears, "Have you finished dealing with the matters outside?" Daoist Qian Deng bowed slightly and nodded, "Yes, the sect is now stable. Many disciples are in their positions and there is nothing out of the ordinary." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. "Qian Deng, you've contributed greatly to the stable situation after the great change." Daoist Qian Deng smiled, "It's all thanks to you, Uncle Master, that our Kunlun sect is able to remain calm in the face of danger." True Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment and then asked, "How is idle month?" Daoist Qian Deng paused for a moment and subconsciously glanced at Zhuo Xian, who was standing on the opposite side. At this moment, Zhuo Xian happened to look at him as well, as if this question had touched him. Their gazes met in the air for a moment and then moved away. Daoist Qian Deng respectfully said to True Lord Tianlan, "Senior brother sect master is seriously injured and can't handle matters. For the sake of his cultivation and longevity, he had no choice but to go into seclusion in his cave abode. I'm afraid he won't be able to come out for the next 10 years. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded before sighing all of a sudden. "Junior niece Xian Yu is my senior brother's favorite disciple and he had high hopes for her. It's a pity that she didn't want to meet with such a calamity." Daoist Qian Deng and Zhuo Xian both looked down at the ground and didn't reply. After a moment, True Lord Tianlan said to Daoist Qian Deng, "You've been busy for the whole day. Go and rest. I'm afraid you'll be busy for the next few days. Thank you for your hard work." Daoist Qian Deng hurriedly stood up and said, "Uncle Master, you flatter me. This is what I should do. In fact, I'm not very capable. Ever since I was appointed as the acting sect master, I've always been afraid that I won't be able to do my job well and let down the ancestors and Uncle Master's trust. In fact, if Uncle Master is free, on behalf of the 100,000 disciples in the sect, Qian Deng earnestly asks Uncle Master Qian Deng to take this position. Our Kunlun sect will be able to rise again and regain the glory of our ancestors." Zhuo Xian frowned slightly and glanced at Daoist Qian Deng. True Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment and then revealed a faint smile. He looked at Daoist Qian Deng and said, "Are you serious?" Daoist Qian Deng's heart suddenly skipped a beat and a chill appeared in his body. Chapter 246. There was a moment of silence in the hall. Daoist Master Qian Deng couldn't help but sneak a glance at True Lord Tianlan. He saw that the tall and sturdy man on the main seat had a gentle smile on his face. He looked benevolent and kind as he stared at him. After a moment, Daoist Master Qian Deng respectfully said, "I am not lying." True Lord Tianlan suddenly laughed and pointed at Daoist Master Qian Deng. He then turned to Zhuo Xian and said, "Look, Qian Deng is such a humble person. He really doesn't care about fame and fortune." Zhuo Xian smiled and nodded. "That is true. I have always admired senior brother Qian Deng's noble character." Daoist Master Qian Deng smiled and nodded at Zhuo Xian. His eyes also softened. At this time, True Lord Tianlan said, "There are many complicated matters in the sect. I also have a lot of things to do in the Immortal Alliance, so it is better that you take this seat." Daoist Master Qian Deng's heart relaxed, but his face still showed some fear and trepidation. He spoke for a while more before taking his leave. Watching Taoist Master Qian Deng's departing figure, the smile on true Lord Tianlan's face gradually faded. When the figure of the current acting sect master of the Kunlun party disappeared from his sight, true Lord Tianlan's face was already indifferent and calm. It was quiet in the side hall. Zhuo Xian stood silently at the side, his eyes looking at his nose looking at his heart. After an unknown amount of time, no one spoke in the hall. Zhuo Xian's body didn't move at all, but a faint trace of cold sweat seeped out of his forehead. Just when the sudden cold atmosphere was about to suffocate everyone, perfected Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the main seat, broke the silence and said, "Xianyue is your senior brother. Aren't you going to see him?" When Zhuo Xian heard this person's voice, he let out a breath with great difficulty. However, after hearing these words, his relaxed heart instantly tightened again. He didn't dare to have the slightest hesitation and said, "I didn't go to see him." "Senior brother Xian, you didn't see the big picture and didn't judge people well. There have long been complaints in the sect. Now that he's in seclusion to recuperate, Martial Uncle is showing him mercy. I thank Martial Uncle on behalf of Senior Idol Month." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was indifferent, as though he didn't react to Zhuo Xian's flattery. Instead, after pondering for a moment, he suddenly thought of something and said to Zhuo Xian, "I remember that senior brother Bai Chen just took in a new final disciple a few days ago. She's a girl in her early teens and is extremely talented. Her name is White Lotus. Where is she now?" Zhuo Xian's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly bowed and replied, "Reporting to Martial Uncle, junior sister is young and playful. On the night of the full moon, she went down the winter peak by herself. I haven't seen her since then." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned slightly before saying to Zhuo Xian, "Senior brother Bai Chen has just passed away. How can his disciples not observe mourning in front of his coffin? Go find her and bring her back. Don't let senior brother's disciple wander outside the Kunlun party." Zhuo Xian took a deep breath and felt his body turn slightly cold. However, he still replied respectfully, "Yes, I understand. I'll definitely bring her back." Perfected Lord Tianlan turned his gaze and stared at Zhuo Xian for a moment before nodding. His expression eased up a little, as though he was about to say something. However, at that moment, there was a series of footsteps outside the side hall, followed by a clear voice. "Disciple He seeks an audience with Perfected Lord." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced outside the door before nodding at Zhuo Xian. Zhuo Xian bowed and retreated. After walking to the door, he saw He standing a few feet away from the door, waiting patiently. Zhuo Xian revealed a smile and nodded at He. He returned the smile and said, "Greetings, Uncle Master Zhuo." Zhuo Xian said, "Go in. Uncle Master Tianlan is inside." After saying that, the two of them brushed past each other. He took a deep breath, then strode forward and walked in with steady steps. Disciple He greets Perfected Lord. He's voice seemed to be particularly steady and powerful, echoing in this secluded hall. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him with a faint smile on his face. "You're here. Sit down and talk." "Thank you, Perfected Lord." He sat down next to him with a respectful expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "You did very well this time. I'm very satisfied." He hurriedly stood up to express his gratitude. However, his expression still seemed a little unnatural at this time, probably because he thought of what he had done. Tianlan waved his hand to indicate that he didn't need to be so polite. After a moment of silence, He took a step forward and said, "Perfected Lord, disciple came here today to report something to you. I've just come back from Kunwu City. Since last night, when we found many demons from the devil cult, our Kunlun disciples had a fierce battle with them. Now, it can be said that we have a complete victory. But..." Speaking up to this point, he suddenly paused as if he was a little hesitant. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and said, "But what? He hesitated for a moment and said, but I heard that yesterday in Kunwa City, a demon from the devil cult with a strange black fire attacked the Su family and killed many people, including the beloved son of the Su family's master, Sumo. He also injured junior martial sister Su Qingjun. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was still indifferent. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. He just said calmly, it seems that this demon isn't weak. He said, that's right. After an investigation, it was found that he was a spy who sneaked into our Kunlun sect. He was a part-time disciple called Lu Chen. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flashed and he said, this person is so cunning. He nodded and said, that's right. We chased after this person, but he is sinister and cunning. We don't know how he escaped from Kunwa City, but he also injured several of our disciples along the way. Now, according to the last news we received, he has probably escaped to the south. The south. Perfected Lord Tianlan murmured. A moment later, he said, could it be that he escaped to the disorienting land? He said, that should be it. The disorienting land is the most chaotic place in the world. It's dangerous and unpredictable. Throughout history, there have been countless desperados and ferocious villains who have fled there when they have nowhere else to go. At the same time, there are also many remnants of the devil cult there. Presumably, that thief also went there. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment and said, I heard that there were many demons from the devil cult inside and outside Kunwa City last night. Why did you only pay attention to this person? He said with emotion, Perfected Lord, this person has been lurking in our Kunlun sect for a long time and has done countless evil deeds in secret. Now, he has even killed and injured our disciples, which can be said to be a heinous crime. Disciple is untalented, but I'm willing to personally go to the disorienting land to kill this person and take his life to comfort the souls of our fellow disciples who have sacrificed themselves. A sharp light flashed across Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. The light at that moment seemed especially dazzling and almost as sharp as a knife. However, he just finished speaking and was lowering his head, so he didn't see this fleeting scene. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't speak right away. Instead, he pondered for a moment and said with a calm expression, I didn't expect you to be so courageous. It's rare in the sect. But I have a feeling that you probably have something to say to me, right? Suddenly, he bent his knees and knelt down in front of Perfected Lord Tianlan. He kowtowed and said in a deep voice, Perfected Lord, please forgive me. I, have an audacious and presumptuous request. Please allow me to state it, Perfected Lord. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, speak. He didn't raise his head and was still kneeling on the ground. With his head touching the cold ground, he said, Disciple is speaking nonsense. I sincerely hope that Perfected Lord will be merciful and accept he as your disciple. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes narrowed slightly. After a while, he slowly stood up with his hands behind his back. He didn't reprimand he who was kneeling on the ground and didn't dare to raise his head, nor did he ask him to get up in a pleasant manner. He merely paced back and forth on the spot in silence. He's body didn't move at all. At this moment, no one knew what he was thinking. However, looking at how he was kneeling on the ground and prostrating himself, it seemed like he was ready to risk everything. Perfected Lord Tianlan took another 2 steps and said indifferently, You want me to accept you as my disciple? He said in a deep voice, That's right. Disciple knows that Perfected Lord has yet to accept a disciple and that he doesn't have a teacher now. Disciple has admired and worshipped Perfected Lord for many years and has always hated that I can't serve Perfected Lord. Today, there might be a chance so Disciple wants to come and plead with Perfected Lord no matter what. Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyes slightly but shifted his gaze from he to the door of the hall. The darkness of the night was boundless as if the whole world was dark and shadows were everywhere. He seemed to be in a trance. After a while, he said, I am Perfected Lord, not everyone can be my disciple. He kowtowed a few times and said, Yes. Disciples' talent and comprehension are considered to be above average in our sect. If Perfected Lord accepts me, I will definitely train hard day and night without slacking off or tarnish your reputation. Other than that, Disciple is going to the chaotic land to hunt down the evil cult spies because I want to show what I have learned to you. Although I don't dare to boast that I am invincible in the world, I will definitely not disappoint you. A glimmer flashed across Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. He then turned around and walked back to his seat. At the moment he turned around, there seemed to be a subtle self-deprecating smile on his face, but it disappeared in a blink of an eye. He said, "So you are going to the chaotic land because of this?" He did not answer but kowtowed and said, "Please accept me, Perfected Lord." Disciple is infatuated and incomparably firm. If there is a chance in the future, Disciple is even more willing to inherit the Tian character Taoist title and inherit Perfected Lord's legacy. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps suddenly stopped. He stood still for a moment and his voice suddenly became much deeper. He said, "You still want my Tian character Taoist title?" He gritted his teeth and said, "Please grant me my wish, Perfected Lord." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a long time with an indifferent expression as if no one could tell what he was thinking. After a long time, he suddenly waved his sleeves and walked out. When he passed by He who was still kneeling on the ground, he said indifferently, "We will talk about this after you go to the chaotic land and kill that person." Chapter 247. There was no one left in the quiet forest. There was only the mess left after the intense battle and 3 lifeless corpses lying in the forest. Among the 3 corpses, 2 of them were the devil cult's disciples who were dressed entirely in black, while the last one was the Kunlun sect's disciple who was the first to rush over here to kill Lu Chen. However, the 3 of them had collapsed at a place that was about the same distance away, yet they were emitting a similar stench of blood. A gust of wind blew through the forest, bringing with it a faint aura. After a while, there was a sudden whistling sound coming from afar. Not long after, it arrived nearby. After a gust of wind swept past, several figures appeared. They were all people dressed in black. The 3 corpses on the ground entered their line of sight immediately. Someone immediately let out a cry of shock. Then, a few people quickly went forward to check. The remaining people had cautious looks in their eyes. They held their weapons and guarded their surroundings, carefully looking into the dark depths of the forest around them. In the end, these black-clothed men were certain that the people on the ground were already dead. There was no way to save them anymore. Each of them stood up with an unpleasant expression. It seemed that one of them who was hot-tempered even used his leg to kick the dead Kunlun disciple as he cursed. A strange wind blew past. 2 figures descended from the sky and landed on the ground. They were Fan Tui and Chen He. When the surrounding black-robed men saw them, they all bowed and paid their respects. Fan Tui nodded his head slightly. Then, he walked to the side of the 3 corpses with Chen He and squatted down to examine them. A strange expression appeared on his face. He wanted to say something but stopped himself. Instead, he extended his hand and waved at the surrounding black-robed men. The rest of the black-robed men quickly walked away without a word, leaving only Fan Tui and Chen He at their original spot. Only then did Fan Tui look at Chen He. He had a look of surprise on his face. He said to Chen He, "What kind of magical technique did this guy use? Why is it so strange?" Chen He also had a serious expression. His gaze swept past the wounds on the corpses in front of him. He said softly, "I have never seen this before either." Fan Tui thought for a moment and said, "You said that this person is very likely to be the traitor from the Battle of the Desolate Valley 10 years ago. It is said that that person was the proud disciple of Elder Yun Shouyang before he rebelled. Could it be that this is also a mysterious technique that is secretly passed down in our holy church?" Chen He shook his head and said, "It doesn't seem like it. At least, I've never seen or heard of the Holy Church having such a strange black flame devil skill. However, these traces seem to be similar to the witchcraft of some southern barbarians in the Land of Chaos." Fan Tui furrowed his brows and said, "Does this mean that we have misjudged him?" Chen He clapped his hands and stood up. A cold smile appeared on his face as he said, "There should be no mistake. No matter what, it is a joyous occasion to be able to discover this traitor. It is also a blessing from the ancestors of the Holy Church. As long as we can kill this traitor, we will be able to comfort the countless brothers of our sect who have died tragically over the past 10 years. If we don't kill him, if we don't tear this person into 1,000 pieces, it will truly be difficult to vent the hatred in my heart. Fan Tui nodded his head and said, that is indeed the case. Then let's continue the chase. That traitor should already be injured. He won't be able to escape quickly. Chen He agreed and walked forward with Fan Tui. Not long after, they walked into the darkness. The group of black-clothed people behind them also quickly followed. Occasionally, someone would sigh regretfully and look back. No one cared about the 3 people who had died on the ground. Perhaps in the future, they would silently rot in the forest like this, turning into dust and returning to this vast forest, becoming a part of the earth between the heavens and the earth. However, not long after they left, a petite white figure suddenly appeared in this dark forest. An extremely beautiful young lady appeared from the darkness. She first looked in the direction that the devil sect members had left in. After confirming that there was indeed no one lying in ambush there, she lowered her head and began to observe the 3 corpses. However, what was strange was that she was not concerned about the Kunlun disciple, nor was she concerned about the person who was wielding the longsword that Chen He and Fan Tui had been examining. Instead, after calmly looking at the 2 people beside her, this young lady's entire attention was on the devil sect disciple who was originally wielding the flying hoop. There were no traces of the black flame curse on this person's corpse. Instead, there were a number of large, bone-deep wounds that cut across his body, causing one's hair to stand on end. It was as if a terrifying beast had pounced on him and wreaked havoc, leaving behind a bloody wound that was too horrible to look at. This beautiful young lady did not look old, but she did not show the slightest hint of fear in the face of such a terrifying wound. Instead, she observed the person's chest with unusual calmness. After taking a closer look, the young lady's expression suddenly turned serious. She stood up and let out a cold grunt. Then, she muttered to herself, that black dog has indeed advanced to become a holy beast. I knew that my guess was right. As she spoke, her eyes darted around, as if she was thinking about something. She was a little hesitant. After a moment, she turned her head to look at the Kunlun mountain in the distance. Then, she turned her head to look at the even further south. After comparing the 2, she suddenly twisted her lips and walked toward the south. It was almost exactly the same direction that Lu Qin had fled in a few hours ago when he was still here. The huge black wolf galloped through the cold and dark night. Its speed was extremely fast, almost like the wind. However, the thick and broad back of this black wolf was unusually stable. Coupled with the soft wolf fur and the warmth that came from under its skin, it made Lu Qin feel as if he had arrived at the most beautiful place in the world. Even though the night was still endless, Lu Qin himself did not know where he was going. However, if he were to head south, he had a rough idea of where he would be heading. It would be nothing more than entering the disorienting lands. There were many people who went to the disorienting lands. Apart from the countless low-level rogue cultivators, there were also many disciples of various sects who had a strong background and divine powers. The disorienting lands was also the hometown of the black dog. The huge black wolf that was carrying Lu Chen on its back was, of course, the black dog. It originally had a powerful bloodline. After Lu Chen had cast a strange spell in the mysterious tree hole, Atsu suddenly erupted with all kinds of signs of power. At the last moment, after the strange full moon, it obtained the power of the full moon and broke through the records of the holy beasts in the southern barbarian tribes. In the process of advancing, Atsu obtained great power. At the same time, its powerful bloodline also displayed great primitive power under the rare moonlight. Almost all of the wounds on Atsu's body had healed. However, the most surprising thing was that the black dog could see again in one of its eyes that had been damaged. It could see again. Atsu's power had skyrocketed by 10 times. Even its body had become unusually large, filled with a strong sense of power. Lu Chen had never seen a so-called holy beast before. He only knew a little about the advancement of holy beasts. However, when this huge black wolf appeared in front of him, Lu Qin could almost recognize it at first glance. It was Atsu. Atsu also recognized him. When it saw that Lu Chen's body was covered with wounds and he looked like a lamp that was about to run out of oil, Atsu looked very anxious. However, in the end, it still brought Lu Chen away from this place. As he ran south, the wind howled. Lu Chen watched the darkness around him recede into the distance. He felt like he was swimming to the shore in the sea. However, he knew that it was just an illusion. The Kunlun party and the devil cult, these two great forces, were not willing to let him go. There was no longer a place for him in this world. Perhaps, only the chaotic and dangerous disorientated lands would be his final home. Lu Chen suddenly thought of the things he had done in the disorientated lands 10 years ago. The corners of his mouth curled into a bitter smile. He did not expect that after more than 10 years, he would once again go to that disgusting place. The black wolf's bulging muscles were like a horned dragon. Every muscle showed the unbelievable power in this black wolf's body. However, this did not stop more people who wanted his life. The assassins arrived very quickly, including some disciples from the famous sections. After Lu Chen managed to deal with a group of people, he could only order Atsu to run into the forest instead of using the wide official road. This move was indeed effective. After entering the forest, the few Kunlun disciples behind them did not catch up. Instead, the devil cult assassins came one after another. However, the current Atsu was no longer the same as before. After absorbing the full moon essence, its power had increased greatly. It was possible that it was now a very powerful mutt in the vast land of the divine boat. This so-called powerful was because when they hid in the forest, Atsu would secretly lurk in the darkness for a while. Then, after a while, when it came back, Lu Chen saw something at the edge of Atsu's mouth. It even carried a faint smell of blood. That was a certain part of the body of the assassins who were chasing after them. On about the 7th day, Lu Chen and Atsu, who had been trekking over mountains and rivers, suddenly saw a familiar scene in their memories. It was the Dragon and Tiger Mountains, side by side. Between the two mountains, there was a long and narrow passage that extended deep inside. Far away, in the distance, was the world's most dangerous place, the disorientated lands, which made all the cultivators in the world change their expressions at the mention of it. Lu Chen's body was originally like a lamp that had run out of oil. But after these 7 days of fleeing, the toughness of his body was once again displayed. He actually started to slowly recover his vitality. But when they started to walk towards the Dragon and Tiger Mountains, preparing to enter the passage and enter the disorientated lands, Lu Chen, who was still sitting on Hei Lang Atsu, suddenly sat up straight and then used his hand to lightly pat Atsu's head. Atsu immediately obediently stopped. Lu Chen looked ahead, his expression suddenly became somewhat ugly. He saw that in front of him, on the passage between the valleys, there was actually a lady standing there. Her appearance was charming and beautiful, her figure was exquisite and graceful. The front of her clothes seemed to be unbuttoned, faintly revealing some snow-white fullness. It actually had a kind of charm that could hook one's soul. But, what was even more strange was, on that lady's face, there was a grave and stern expression, even in that bright gaze, there was a bit of cold murderous intent. Just like that, she looked towards Lu Chen. Chapter 248. After fleeing for so many days, Lu Chen's injuries still hadn't fully healed. However, compared to when he had just escaped from Kunwa City, he was already much better. At the very least, he could now walk with some difficulty. However, ever since the black wolf Atsu advanced on the night of the full moon, it seemed as if it had changed completely. From day to night, it seemed as if it had endless energy and didn't feel anything while carrying Lu Chen on its back. Thus, Lu Chen simply used it as a mount all the way to the south. However, aside from the fact that Atsu sometimes ran too fast and was a bit bumpy, having such a mighty and domineering big black wolf as a mount was indeed very impressive and convenient. In fact, the reason why Lu Chen's injuries were able to recover so quickly was largely due to the fact that Atsu carried him all the way. Not only did it avoid most of the pursuers, it also saved him a lot of energy. However, now that they were in front of the Dragon and Tiger Mountains, they could enter the land of confusion through the canyon. Although it wasn't like they could fly freely in the sky and swim freely in the vast sea, it was still safer in the chaotic and dangerous land of confusion. However, at this moment, the woman who appeared in the narrow and long path in the canyon looked rather frail. She stood in the middle of the path and blocked the only path between the two mountains. Lu Chen jumped down from Atsu's back and slowly walked to the entrance of the canyon with Atsu following behind him. At this moment, the black wolf's body was abnormally huge. Just standing there, it seemed as if it wasn't much shorter than Lu Chen. With a pair of large wolf eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, it was extremely imposing. It could be said that it was ferocious as it glared fiercely at the woman in front of it. Lu Chen raised his head to look around and frowned slightly. He had lived in Crescent City for a period of time, so he wasn't unfamiliar with the area around Dragon and Tiger Mountains. If he remembered correctly, this small path in the valley was usually not so quiet. Even though there weren't many people here, it was common to see people coming and going. However, at this moment, apart from him and the woman who blocked the way, there was no one else in front of and behind the Dragon and Tiger Mountains. At this moment, the tall mountains were covered with green trees and vines. Occasionally, the cries of apes and birds could be heard. This was the only sound in this place. Everything was cold and cheerless to the point it was slightly unusual. Lu Chen's gaze once again descended onto the woman. He was just about to speak when his gaze suddenly focused because he saw a red-colored jade embedded on the woman's chest where the collar that stuck closely to her fair skin. It was shaped like an aureole, and its color was bright red and gorgeous. It looked lifelike, and it actually seemed as if it would flap its wings and soar into the sky. Lu Chen took a deep breath, his expression suddenly became serious. Looking at this woman, his voice also became deeper. Shuang. Shuang was a woman's nickname, her real name was Shuang. She was the current leader of Fuyunji in Zhengxianmeng. In Zhengxianmeng, where cultivators were as numerous as the rain and experts were as numerous as the clouds, those who could hold the position of a division and a hall's leader were not simple people, not to mention Fuyunji, this kind of frontline hall that had been fighting tit for tat with the evil faction all year round, attacking each other and killing each other. Shuang became the leader of Fuyunji 10 years ago. Her identity and origin had always been mysterious. Her master's skills, supernatural powers, magical weapons, and so on were all mysteries. Outsiders only knew that this woman had a seductive and beautiful appearance, but her way of doing things was very experienced. She was strict with her subordinates and even more ruthless to her enemies. Over the years, the number of evil faction disciples that died in Fuyunji's hands was uncountable. Furthermore, it was said that within the evil faction, there was an assassination list that recorded the enemies of the evil faction that they had a blood feud with. They were the enemies that the evil faction would kill at all costs, and Shuang was ranked third on this assassination list. Other than that, Shuang herself was also a rather legendary woman in Zhengxianmeng. Because of her high cultivation and natural beauty, coupled with her high position, she attracted the attention of countless people. Of course, there were also those who coveted her. But over the years, Shuang had always kept people at a distance, treating almost everyone with the same indifference. Of course, this was a very offensive way of doing things. Of course, if someone really coveted her beauty, no matter how much she feigned civility, as long as she didn't go to bed with him, she would still offend him. This was a very common thing in the cultivation world where male cultivators were the majority. But compared to other female cultivators, although Shuang had always been a maverick, she did not suffer any setbacks because of this. The biggest reason for this was that she actually had a huge and powerful backer behind her, and that was Supreme Lord Tianlan. Fuyunji was a sect that Supreme Lord Tianlan had single-handedly established, and he had never allowed any outsiders to interfere. Over the years, Shuang had even become the #1 general under Supreme Lord Tianlan's command in Zhengxianmeng. No one dared to provoke her because they were afraid of hurting her. Lu Chen had never seen this legendary woman in Zhengxianmeng, but he had once lived in seclusion for 10 years with the help of Fuyunji, so of course he had heard some things about Fuyunji. He had also heard some stories about Shuang, especially about her appearance, which had been described countless times in the legends. And when he called out the two words, Shuang, the woman's gaze also fell on his face. Her eyes were very bright, and just like the legend said, because they were too bright, they seemed a bit fierce, as if they could see through a person's flesh and go straight to their heart with a single glance. And after looking at Lu Chen for a moment, the woman also opened her mouth and said, Lu Chen. Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said, You know me? Shuang stared at him and said, You are the greatest shadow of my Fuyunji in the past 10 years, how could I not know you? Lu Chen's expression changed slightly, then he took a deep breath and looked at Shuang. For a while, the two did not speak, faintly facing each other on this valley path. After a while, Lu Chen said, Please make way, I want to go over. Shuang had no intention of making way. She calmly looked at Lu Chen and suddenly said, Do you know that the fate of a shadow is to never see the light in this life? Lu Chen didn't say anything. Shuang continued, What you did in Kunghua City was the same as bringing about your own destruction, do you know that? Lu Chen glanced at her, but he still remained silent. Shui Ying's expression was calm, no emotions could be seen on her face. It seemed that from the beginning to the end, she was just calmly narrating some things. She said, I don't care if you don't want to live, but you hid in Fuyunji for 10 years. Have you ever thought about what will happen to the people who have taken care of you all these years? The devil cult will definitely pursue you relentlessly. If they catch you, my subordinates will probably be dragged into this mess. Shuang looked at Lu Chen and said, If that's the case, I feel that since you're already in a hopeless situation, you might as well die earlier. What do you think? Lu Chen suddenly smiled and said, You want me to die? Shuang said, I think it's better for you to die than to live. At least you won't be a burden to others. Her eyes suddenly became a bit colder, looking as cold as a frosty blade. She said, In any case, you've already caused the deaths of many people, right? Lu Chen's expression instantly became cold. It seemed that these words still stung him. This woman, Shuang, was indeed as sharp as the rumors said. However, he still endured it. After a moment, he indifferently said, You're in charge of Fuyunji, so I think you should know my identity and background. Shuang sneered and said, Of course I know. A few years ago, I even went to Qingshui village to secretly see you. Lu Chen was startled. He didn't have any impression of this woman in his memory. Presumably, Shuang had been spying on him without his knowledge. This gave him a strange feeling. However, now was not the time to think about these things. He looked at Shuang and said, You came here to stop me. Was it his idea? Who he was, Lu Chen didn't say, and Shuang didn't ask either. However, they both seemed to know in their hearts. Shuang only shook her head and said, Now that things have come to this, even Fuyunji can't protect you from publicly using evil arts in the big city. We can only say that it has nothing to do with you. Even for the sake of our own Fengyu, after today, we might even arrange for people to come and kill you. Do you understand? Lu Chen's expression was normal. He nodded and said, I understand, I don't blame you. Shuang snorted, looking somewhat disdainful. However, the originally sharp gaze in the depths of her eyes seemed to have softened a little. Then, she took a step to the side and opened up half of the path. She said, You can go. In the future, if you're found by the evil sect's demons, before you get caught, I advise you to kill yourself. Lu Chen strode forward, Atsu following closely behind him. As he walked past Shuang, Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly stopped. Atsu also quickly noticed and immediately stopped. Then, it bared its teeth and stared at Shuang with incomparable ferocity. Being stared at by such a murderous beast as if it wanted to devour someone, it really made one's heart palpitate. However, Shuang didn't seem to feel anything. Instead, she focused her gaze and stared back at Atsu. That gaze seemed to be even more ferocious and savage than the black wolf. It was as if in the next moment, this woman was prepared to skin the black wolf and cook it into a big pot of hot soup. Moreover, Her aura instantly surged and actually directly suppressed Atsu. Atu let out a whimper and jumped away in shock. As a demonic beast, its sensitivity to the strong far surpassed that of a human's. Atu immediately ran forward, and in a single breath, he ran several zhang away before stopping. Then, with a lingering fear, he turned his head back and looked around. Lu Chen's expression didn't change. He only stood in front of Xuanying and stared at her. Xuanying turned her gaze from Atsu and looked at him calmly. "What is it?" Lu Chen said, "I think there's something wrong with what you said earlier." Xuanying said, "Which one?" Lu Chen said, "Becoming a shadow, you will never see the light for the rest of your life." Xuanying sneered and said, "Am I wrong?" Lu Chen was silent for a long time. Then, his voice became somewhat low. He said, "I have been in the darkness for several decades. I want to go to a place where there is light to live. I really want to know what that feels like." After saying this, he directly turned around and walked past this beautiful and charming woman who was as sharp as a knife without looking back. Xuanying stared at his back without saying a word. At this time, a gust of wind seemed to rise, blowing across the valley. A strand of Xuanying's hair swayed slightly in the wind. Chapter 249. After watching the man and wolf leave, Xuanying still stood in the same place. Her expression was plain and cold, as if Lu Chen's last words before he left had not touched her in the slightest. The wind blew through the gorge, and the trees on both sides of the mountain swayed. She was the only one left in the vast mountain range. After a while, a red shadow suddenly swept out from the mountain forest on her left. It descended from the sky, made a turn in the air, and landed lightly next to Xuanying. "Sister Ying, why did you let him go?" The one who spoke was a woman dressed in red. Her features were picturesque, and she was also extremely beautiful. However, compared to Xuanying's flirtatious and sharp beauty, this woman in red was a little less fierce, but more passionate. Even when she asked Xuanying a question with some doubt, her face still had a somewhat passionate feeling, just like the red clothes she wore, bold and passionate. Xuanying glanced at the woman in red, and her eyes clearly softened. However, she did not immediately answer her, and instead asked, "You think we shouldn't let him go?" "Of course." The woman in red said without hesitation, "This person has worked in our Fuyunji for many years. Let's not talk about how many people he knows, but he definitely knows some of our secrets. If he is captured by the evil cult, the consequences will be hard to control." Xuanying was silent for a moment, but still shook her head, and said, "Black Wolf has made great contributions to our Fuyunji, no, to Zhengxiameng and the entire righteous world. We can't treat him like those useless shadows who are just eating and waiting to die." The woman in red curled her lips, as if she did not agree. Xuanying glanced at her, and sighed, and said, "You are still young, and have not experienced the bloody days of 10 years ago when the evil cult was still flourishing. You can't imagine it just by listening to stories." At this point, there seemed to be a trace of sadness on her face. She said softly, "No matter what, we still owe him." The lady in red appeared to be extremely respectful towards Xuanying. Since Xuanying had said so, she did not say anything more. Instead, after a moment of silence, she turned her head to look in the direction that Lu Chen had come from and said, "Since that is the case, the evil cult's pursuers who are chasing after He Lang will most likely be here soon. Should we leave or stay?" Xuanying said indifferently, "You stay here and help him hold them off for 3 days." The red-clothed woman was stunned for a moment. She pulled on Xuanying's sleeve and said, "Sister Ying, why did you give me this difficult task again?" "No, I want to go back to the immortal city with you." Xuanying waved her hand and said, "Things have changed recently, so I won't be returning to the immortal city for now. I might have to go to the western continent's Kunlun mountain. There's no point in you following me. What's more, it's very difficult to defend a place now. There will be evil cult's demons coming to us. We can use this opportunity to cut off some of the evil cult's wings. I'll leave this matter to you." The red-clothed woman grunted. It seemed that she was not afraid of the bloody and murderous task that Xuanying had given her. She had a calm expression on her face. However, she quickly asked, then what about after this matter is finished? Should I return to the Immortal City first or go to the Kunlun Mountain to find you? Shuang hesitated for a moment and said, you go to the disorienting land and follow Hei Lang. The red-clothed woman was shocked and said, why? Could it be that you want me to protect him? Shuang shook her head and said, that's not it. Just follow that person. No matter what happens, you don't need to do anything. I'll contact you after I go to the Western continent. At that time, whether you leave or stay, or treat him, we'll see when the time comes. The red-clothed woman nodded, but her expression changed slightly. Shuang was a meticulous woman. After glancing at her, she said, what's wrong? The red-clothed woman hesitated for a moment and said, Sister Ing, didn't you just say that we owe him? If that's the case, it's understandable that you want me to protect him. But why do I hear that last sentence of yours? It seems like it might be disadvantageous to him as well. Shuang fell silent and did not speak for a long time. Just when the red-clothed woman was a little worried that she had said something wrong, Shuang sighed and said, whether we owe him or not, it's not up to me to decide. Isn't it just a word from our superiors? The red-clothed woman was slightly startled after hearing this. Then, a trace of sympathy appeared on her face and she said in a low voice, if that's the case, then that man is really quite pitiful. Shuang suddenly seemed to be a little dispirited. She waved her hand and said, do your own thing. After saying this, she turned around and walked out of the canyon. Her speed seemed slow, but it was actually very fast. Not long after, she had gone far away. The red-clothed woman was left standing there, but she looked around in high spirits. Then, she turned her head and looked into the depths of the canyon. In front of the canyon was the world's most dangerous place, the disorienting land. She suddenly smiled, as if she was a little more interested in that direction. Ever since they entered the disorienting land, Lu Chen suddenly felt the pressure on his body lighten a lot. Relying on his familiarity with the disorienting land, he led the black wolf Atsu and fled into the depths of the disorienting land. It had been several days since he sensed any devil cult killers approaching from behind. Even so, the string of tension in Lu Chen's heart did not loosen. Because in this world, no one understood the true craziness and danger of the devil cult followers of the three realms better than him. Generally speaking, if one wanted to enter the disorienting land from the passage around Crescent City and Longhu Mountain, if one wanted to go deeper into the disorienting land, the most common path would be the Black Armor Mountain Cyan Sunflower Cave. It could lead to the famous Desolate Valley, and it could also reach the Dragon River that separated the periphery of the disorienting land from the central region. This was the path that ordinary cultivators would choose under most circumstances. It was relatively safe and easy to travel. However, after walking in the direction of the Black Armor Mountain for a day, Lu Chen gave up on this idea and led the Atsu in another direction. One man and one wolf walked for a few days in the vast wilderness of the Land of Chaos, traversing through the primitive forests and rivers. After making a huge detour, they finally arrived at the lower reaches of a large river. They then began to walk up from the bottom. It was a journey along the shore of a wide and calm river. There were many dangers along the way, and many ferocious demonic beasts appeared. However, relying on Atu, who was now powerful, and Lu Chen, who was gradually recovering his strength, the two of them still managed to make it through without any danger. Until they arrived at a river valley. Standing at the entrance of the river valley and looking into the distance, they could see a tall mountain peak. If Lu Chen remembered correctly, that should be the Black Armor Mountain. In the river valley in front of them, under the illumination of the sun, there was a sea of dazzling and beautiful flowers in full bloom, as if they were blooming brilliantly in the sun. Everything seemed to float in front of them again, as if it was yesterday. Lu Chen stood quietly at the entrance of the river valley, gazing at the sea of flowers. The Atsu stood beside him with a somewhat gloomy expression. Occasionally, it would growl a few times uneasily, wagging its tail, and move closer to Lu Chen. Lu Chen nodded and sighed softly. He then reached out and touched the head of the Atsu, saying, let's go to the place where you first appeared. Of course, no one knew where Atsu was first born. Even the Atsu probably didn't have this memory. But that day, when Lu Chen and Exian passed through this river valley full of blood-devouring demon flowers, it was indeed the first time they saw the Atsu. Those days seemed to be fresh in their memory, as if it was yesterday, but now things were the same, but people had changed. Lu Chen and the Atsu walked along the edge of the river valley, always keeping a safe distance from the beautiful but extremely dangerous blood-devouring demon flowers. In the middle, Lu Chen had also seen the open space where the dying puppy was used as bait. But now it was flat without a trace, as if nothing had happened. Where was the person? If a person died, would it be as if nothing had happened? The beauty would vanish like smoke, and after all the prosperity was gone, there would only be a bleak cold wind blowing past. Lu Chen didn't know if there was an answer to this question. He just walked silently towards the forest. The Atsu followed behind him, raised its head and sniffed the air a few times. Suddenly, it let out a low growl, as if it was a little angry. They walked through the forest, all the way. Although it had been a long time, and the forest was full of weeds and thorns, Lu Chen still seemed to remember the path they walked through here. He led the Atsu around the strange rocks and trees in the forest, and then came to the side of the cave. Roar! Atsu became even more agitated. His sharp teeth kept grinding against each other, making a terrifying sound. His eyes shone with a cold light as he scanned the surroundings of the cave. He looked like he was about to devour anyone who stood in his way. Lu Chen jumped down and looked around. He saw that the place was still full of strange rocks, but it seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. There was a lot of dust at the entrance of the cave, and he didn't know how long it had been since someone came in or out of it. He seemed to think of something and turned to look in a certain direction. At this time, the Atsu also jumped to his side and looked in the same direction. Then, their eyes stopped at a certain place at the same time. In the pile of rocks on the riverbank, a white bone was vaguely exposed. The Atsu growled, and Lu Chen nodded and walked over. The rocks gradually dispersed in front of his eyes. Under the sunlight, he saw a terrifying skeleton among the rocks. However, it was now scattered beyond recognition. Moreover, there were obvious bite marks on many of the bones. Lu Chen looked at the skeleton for a moment, expressionless, then turned to the Atsu and said lightly, "Let's go." He stepped over the skeleton, walked to the distance of the riverbank, and walked to the unknown forest in front of him, which no one had ever stepped into. In front of him, maybe it was the place where the barbarian came from. The Atsu shouted behind him and followed. When it walked past the pile of rocks, it stepped on the skull with one of its feet, and with a bang, the white skull was broken into pieces, and then it went far away. Chapter 250. The sudden battle on the night of the full moon was a great fright for Kunwa City, which had been peaceful for a long time. But to be honest, the destruction caused by this battle couldn't be considered particularly large. It was nothing more than some buildings collapsing and a few unlucky people who happened to get close to the muzzle of the gun and died gloomily. The reason for this situation was that the two parties involved in the battle, the Kunlun party and the devil cult, were mostly young disciples. Although there were some outstanding disciples, they were generally a bit weaker. On the Kunlun party's side, there was a secret. Most of the powerful and profound Taoist master Yuanying were pinned down on Heavenly Kun Peak. Compared to the threat of the devil cult, the matter they had to face that night was more tense and urgent. On the devil cult's side, their strength had probably been damaged in the past 10 years. Few Yuanying experts with strong Taoist magic appeared, or even if there were experts, they were afraid of the Kunlun party's strength and didn't dare to make a move. As for the real reason, only the devil cult themselves knew. In short, after the battle on the night of the full moon, although Kunwa City was in a state of panic for a while, it was still the territory of the Kunlun party. In the following days, the Kunlun party ruthlessly sifted this lively city and cleaned up many of the shadows that were originally hiding in the dark. As the saying goes, how can one allow others to sleep beside one's bed? The Kunlun party was one of the top sects in the world, so it was impossible for them to allow the devil cult to develop their power next to them. As a result, the devil cult spies in Kunwa City were almost wiped out. After all, Kunwa City was a place where the Kunlun party had operated for countless years. They were deeply rooted in every aspect and infiltrated everywhere. Once a serious investigation was carried out, the majority of the devil cult spies wouldn't be able to hide. Following such a big movement, Kunwa City also quickly settled down. The dead were buried, the collapsed houses were rebuilt, and everything returned to its original appearance. It was bustling, flourishing, and flourishing as if nothing had ever happened. And what happened that night also became the topic of people's after-dinner conversations. Since ancient times, as long as it had nothing to do with them, in the eyes and hearts of most people in the world, it would end up like this. In the end, the big event would become a small matter, and then it would become a dry and colorless impression in their memories. But to those who were there, experienced that cruel battle, and witnessed death with their own eyes, those memories were completely different. They were filled with sorrow, anger, and hatred that was difficult to suppress. On that night, the Su family in Kunwa City was one of the places that suffered the most damage in the whole city. Their gate fell, their high walls collapsed, and in the end, many people died. Logically speaking, everyone only had one life, but there was no such thing as absolute fairness in this world. In everyone's eyes, some people's lives were more important and precious than others. After that night, the Su family sank into a gloomy atmosphere. Many people in their family died, but everyone seemed to only pay attention to the dead young man named Sumo because he was the son of the head of the Su family and Su Qingjuan's younger brother. White cloths were hung on the door, wreaths were piled up, and elegiac couplets were filled with sad eulogies that were both sincere and hypocritical. A coffin made of red nanmu was placed in front of the Su family's mourning hall. Over there, Sumo's mother's face was covered in tears, crying herself hoarse. Sumo's father, Su Tianhe, was handling many chores in front of the hall. As the head of the Su family and a man, he was obviously much more unyielding than his wife. But even so, his expression was extremely haggard. In addition to them, many members of the Su family were also in front of the mourning hall. Most of them were dressed in white, handling the unusually sad funeral affairs. Then, listening to the bitter wail of Madame Bai, all of them had complicated expressions and looked at each other from time to time. "Son, you died so miserably, it's a pity that you suffered such an unexpected disaster at such a young age. God is really blind. Why didn't the person who should die, but let me, the white-haired person, see the black-haired person die?" The crying was extremely sharp, as if it was a sharp thorn that made people feel uncomfortable. Many people at the side frowned, but no one dared to speak. And compared to the grandeur of this mourning hall, the people who died at the same time that night were not so lucky. At this time, no one knew where they were. Either they had no funeral affairs and were hastily buried, or they were casually held by their own family members. While the place was bustling, a figure suddenly walked in from outside. It was Su Qingjun. Her body looked much thinner than before, and her face was still pale. It seemed that the injuries she had suffered that day had not healed. But to her, the injuries on her body were probably not important. Her entire appearance seemed to be much colder than before. Seeing Su Qingjun walk into the mourning hall, the surrounding people immediately quieted down. For a moment, only Madame Bai was still crying and screaming in front of her. At this moment, Su Qingjun was also dressed in white. She looked around, and her gaze finally fell on the coffin above the mourning hall and the crying mother. Her eyes could not help but redden a little, and she slowly walked over. She squatted behind Madame Bai and gently hugged her body. Madame Bai leaned against her chest, still crying non-stop, her mouth hoarsely crying non-stop. It seemed that Sumo's death was a great blow to her. Su Qingjun took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and then softly said, "Mother, please restrain your grief. Otherwise, your body, what's wrong with my body?" Madame Bai suddenly stopped crying, and asked coldly. Standing to the side, Su Tianhe seemed to feel something, frowned slightly, and turned to look at her. Su Qingjun was startled, and said, "You have been crying here for 2 days, you should rest, or your body will not be able to take it." If I can't take it, then just die. Madame Bai suddenly threw herself to the side of the coffin and cried. Su Qingjun hurriedly pulled her back, and tried to persuade her, but her mouth was almost dry, but there was no reaction from Madame Bai. Instead, after a short pause, Madame Bai suddenly turned to glare at her, and a trace of hatred and anger appeared in her eyes. Su Qingjun was shocked, and said, Mother, why are you looking at me like this? Let me ask you, why didn't you save Mo? Why did you watch him die? Madame Bai suddenly raised her voice, and asked loudly to Su Qingjun. Su Qingjun's head buzzed, and it seemed that she couldn't react for a moment. She looked at her mother in shock, and the large group of people in the morning hall instantly fell silent. After a moment, Su Qingjun said with a trembling voice, Mother, no, it's not like that. Madame Bai suddenly stood up, and stared at Su Qingjun with a distorted face, and shouted, I saw it clearly that day, you obviously had the upper hand in the battle with that scoundrel, why did you suddenly lose? Also, that scoundrel clearly knew you. He originally wanted to kill your father and me, but you stopped him. Why didn't you stop him from killing Mo? Su Qingjun's mouth was half open, and she wanted to say something, but stopped. There was sorrow and pain on her face, and after a moment, 2 clear lines of tears flowed down. She just shook her head and smiled bitterly, and said in a low voice, Mother, it's not like that. The surrounding crowd was in an uproar, and the sound of discussion instantly merged into a wave of sound. At this moment, who knew how many people were looking at Su Qingjun with a strange gaze? The originally high and mighty woman, who was already a genius of Jean Dan Friar at such a young age, at this moment, it seemed that she could be despised and discussed at will, like a beautiful jade covered in dust, and everyone couldn't help but want to trample on her. Enough! There was a shout, and it was Su Tianhe who strode over. His face was dark, but he looked around, and then directly waved his hand, saying, Everyone, please leave for a moment. Our family has something to say. He had been in charge of the Su family for many years, and people had always been in awe of him. Although this action was a little unreasonable in front of the morning hall, in the end, everyone slowly left. When only the 3 of them were left in the morning hall, Su Tianhe's expression eased a little. He silently glanced at his wife who was standing next to him in tears, and after a sigh, he said, June, was just trying to persuade you out of kindness. Why did you deliberately embarrass her in front of so many people? Madame Bai's face was gloomy. She suddenly pointed at the coffin and cried, Is what I said wrong? Mo is lying in there now, without a complete corpse, and his body has been separated from his body, and his body has been stabbed so many times. Isn't he pitiful? As his sister, don't you feel even a little bit guilty? She said the last sentence to Su Qingjun while crying. Su Qingjun clenched her teeth, but did not say a word. Su Tianhe looked at his wife, who seemed to have gone mad, and then looked at Su Qingjun. He let out a long sigh, and then pulled Su Qingjun to the side of the morning hall. After they were a little further away from Madame Bai, Su Tianhe lowered his voice and said, June, when Mo's funeral is finished, you should go back to Kunlun Mountain. Su Qingjun's body shook, and her face was pale. She trembled and said, Father, do you also blame me? Do you not want me anymore? Su Tianhe shook his head and said, Mo's death, of course, I am also heartbroken, but not to the extent of losing my mind. Su Qingjun shed tears and said, Then why did you ask me to leave the family? Shouldn't you ask me to stay here to help you? Su Tianhe smiled bitterly and said, There's nothing to help. That's all there is to it. In fact, the Su family will be handed over to you sooner or later, and the others are not worth mentioning. He paused and said, I asked you to leave first, mainly because I don't want to provoke your mother. She loved Mo the most in her life, and Mo's death is a great blow to her. You should stay away for the time being. Su Qingjun said in a low voice, Then when can I come back? Su Tianhe shook his head and said, I don't know, maybe. A glimmer of hope appeared on Su Qingjun's face, and she asked, Maybe what? Su Tian. He glanced at Madame Bai in the distance, and his eyes flickered slightly. He said softly, "You have seen your mother. She has lost her mind, and I am also worried that something will happen to her. Maybe, if you can avenge Sumo, you will treat her better, and you can come back at any time." Su Qingjuan's body trembled slightly, and then she quickly fell silent. Chapter 251. Su Tianhe immediately sensed something and said, "Why? You don't want to?" He frowned and looked at his daughter, saying in a low voice, "It can't be as your mother said, that you really have something to do with the murderer, right?" Su Qingjun shook her head and said bitterly, "No." Su Tianhe stared at her for a while and said slowly, "Jun, your talent and aptitude far surpass mine, and your future achievements are limitless. Now that Mo has passed away, the Su family will be handed over to you sooner or later. The thief who killed Mo has a very high cultivation and evil arts. In the Su family, only you can hope to defeat him. In the future, the matter of revenge can only be handed over to you. Do you understand?" Su Qingjuan's face was pale, and even her lips seemed to be drained of blood. But after a while, she finally took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "I understand." "Then you go." Su Tianhe's expression softened and said. Su Qingjun turned around woodenly and slowly walked out of the morning hall. After watching her walk away, Su Tianhe shook his head and walked back to Madame Bai's side. He squatted down next to her and hugged her shoulders gently. "All right, did you hear what I said just now?" Madame Bai's eyes lit up. Madame Bai's crying slowly stopped. After a while, she said faintly, "Will Qingjun really avenge Mo?" Su Tianhe said, "I don't know. In fact, now that the thief is a fugitive, it is still a question whether we can find him in the future. Who can say for sure?" A sad expression flashed across Madame Bai's face again, but she held it back this time and just nodded. Then she looked at the door of the morning hall and said in a low voice, "So Qingjun will suffer?" Su Tianhe said expressionlessly, "We are doing this for her own good. She will understand in the future." As Lu Chen led Atsu deeper into the disorientated lands, he could clearly feel the 5 elemental energies around him becoming chaotic. Even though they weren't at the Dragon River, which meant that they were still in the outskirts of the disorientated lands, the spiritual energy circulation of ordinary cultivators was already beginning to be affected. In comparison, Atsu didn't seem to feel anything. They could run, jump, eat, drink, and sleep every day. Lu Chen initially thought that this was because demonic beasts were naturally different from humans. However, he soon recalled that the demonic beasts in other parts of the Divine Continent were different from those in the Land of Chaos. It was probably because the demonic beasts living in this chaotic and dangerous place had mutated into something different. It seemed that the blood and bones of Atsu originated from this vast but chaotic land, which was why they were able to adapt so naturally. The further they went, the more dangers they encountered along the way. All kinds of strange plants and demonic beasts would appear from time to time. However, Lu Chen and Atsu didn't seem to be weak in combat. Lu Chen, who was gradually recovering from his serious injuries, was very familiar with the situation in the disorientated lands. He was familiar with most of the dangers in the disorientated lands, including all kinds of strange plants and animals. That was why he was able to avoid many dangers. On the other hand, Atsu's situation was different. When Lu Chen first met up with it, Atsu obviously wasn't used to its new body and acted clumsily most of the time. However, as time passed, Atsu's coordination improved and its combat strength increased almost every day. Its strength grew day by day and its movements became more agile. Nowadays, it was rare to see this black wolf fiercely pouncing on its prey and then clumsily pouncing to the side to pounce on empty air. Instead, whenever Atu pounced over, there would be a reign of terror. Its sharp teeth and claws could almost tear apart any demon beast that appeared. Along the way, Atsu also had a teacher. When Lu Chen had nothing better to do, he would grab hold of Atu and teach it some sinister hunting methods. He taught it how to hide in the dark and suddenly jump out to attack, how to stab the eyes and then kick the balls, how to bite the belly, and even how to pretend to be injured and fall to the ground in a fight. Lu Chen even tried to teach Atu a sinister method of pretending to be injured and falling to the ground to lure the opponent over, and then suddenly bite the opponent's throat. Atsu was very smart. It learned these insidious fighting techniques as soon as it learned them. From then on, the demonic beasts in the disorientated lands that blocked their way started to have bad luck. Those ferocious, strong, and huge demonic beasts would often be killed while they were walking, ambushed while they were hunting, and when they suddenly found out that their opponent had been defeated by them, they would happily walk over to feast on their prey. Then, they would be bitten in the throat, kicked in the balls, and beaten to death, often dying with their eyes wide open. After leaving the riverside cave where the barbarian had died, they headed south. There were many hills and rivers along the way, poisonous insects, birds, and beasts could be found everywhere. The road was difficult to walk on and slowed down their speed. However, it was probably because there were few people in this area that Lu Chen did not find any pursuers or killers following them. It was not surprising that the people from the Kunlun party did not chase after them. However, the fact that the killers from the devil cult did not follow them really surprised Lu Chen. He was well aware of his weight in the hearts of the followers of the devil cult. It could be said that he was a person that they would not rest until he was dead. After the initial doubts, he quickly thought of Shuang whom he had met before. Did she help them secretly? After all, she was probably from Fuyunji. Was this considered a form of nostalgia? Lu Chen did not know. He did not understand Shuang, but no matter what, this was indeed very beneficial to him. It also gave him very precious time to rest. So, after walking for another 2 to 3 days, he saw a very strange-looking forest ahead. Suddenly, he discovered movement behind him. He had been a shadow for too long, and lived in the dark world for too many years. He seemed to have an innately sharp intuition towards these kinds of pursuers. It could not be helped. If he did not have this ability, he would probably have died in some dark corner many years ago. He felt movement behind him, and it was not a ferocious and dangerous demonic beast, but a human's aura. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. He did not expect that after using all the means he had to escape, and even with the possible secret help from Fuyunji, he still could not shake off the pursuers. However, his expression did not change much. He just reached out his hand and patted the head of the giant wolf beside him. Then, as if inadvertently, he used his finger and lightly flicked Atsu's ear twice. Atsu turned his head to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen quietly gave a look in the direction of the dense forest beside him. Atsu growled in a low voice. After taking 2 steps forward, he suddenly turned his body and scuttled into the forest beside him. As for Lu Chen, he did not make any more movements. He only shouted for Atsu to not run around, and then walked forward himself. At the same time, he shouted for Atsu to follow him. Atsu seemed to be playing around in the forest, and did not immediately run out. Lu Chen, on the other hand, slowly walked forward with a calm expression. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from behind him, and a snow-white light flashed past, striking towards his back. At the same time, a figure poked his head out from the bushes behind him. Lu Chen leapt forward, dodging the attack. At the same time, he heard an angry roar, and from the other side of the forest, a huge black shadow suddenly rushed over. Black Wolf Atu was like an enraged beast, directly pouncing towards the figure that had suddenly appeared. Then, with its sharp teeth and claws, it greeted the figure coldly. It looked like the ground was about to be splattered with blood. But at this moment, the figure behind suddenly let out a scream. The ray of light in mid-air flickered for a moment and disappeared. In the next moment, it suddenly appeared in front of the figure and blocked Atu's terrifying pounce by a hair's breadth. Atsu was furious. During this period of time, it had long been used to this kind of hunting and sneak attack. Usually, it was always successful. Today was the first time it failed. That could be tolerated, but the wolf absolutely could not. With a howl, Atsu almost stood up and was about to pounce on the figure. Then, It really pounced on her. Then, the figure was angry. Somehow, it dodged the sharp teeth and claws of Atsu, and slapped over. There was a faint sound of wind and snow. With a "pa" sound, it hit the mouth of Atsu. It was like a slap, and then it shouted, "Stupid dog, do you want to rebel?" Atsu was stunned for a moment. When it took a closer look, it saw that under its body was an amazing and beautiful little girl. Impressively, it was White Lotus. Atsu seemed to have a natural fear of this mysterious little girl from the bottom of its heart. This was not a trivial matter. It directly jumped up and jumped back to Lu Chen's side. The sound of its mouth actually turned into woof woof woof, and it barked a few times in succession. This made Lu Chen, who was also a little surprised to see that it was White Lotus, turn his head to look at it in even more surprise. After a moment of silence, Lu Chen asked, "Stupid dog, didn't you become a wolf? Why can you still bark like a dog?" Atsu snorted, as if it was disdainful, and looked at Lu Chen with contempt. Lu Chen shook his head and ignored it. Then he turned his head to look at White Lotus, only to see that the little girl was standing up from the ground and reaching out to pat the dust off her body. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, "Why are you here?" After saying that, he suddenly frowned and said, "That's right, how did you find us?" White Lotus sneered and said, "Finding you is not difficult at all. That stupid dog has the blood food secret technique. In the eyes of people like us who are knowledgeable, this thing is as bright as a lamp at night. Those who can't see it are the blind ones." Lu Chen's face sank and he shook his head, saying, "Forget it, let's not care about this. You, a little girl, suddenly chased us deep into the chaotic lands. What are you doing? The demonic beasts in the chaotic lands do not recognize any five-pillar geniuses. If you are not careful and die here, it will be too late for you and your true monarch master to cry." White Lotus smiled, looking pure and innocent, but there was an indescribable strangeness in her beauty. She smiled and said, "Are you talking about that dead master of mine?" Chapter 252. Lu Chen was startled and frowned. Back then, on the night of the full moon, when Mount Kunlun changed, he did not know that something had happened to Hakushin Jinkuan. However, when he saw the great changes in the sky and the collapse of Winter Peak, Lu Chen actually had some premonition, but he had not confirmed it. These days, he had been chased by both the righteous and evil sections. He had been on the run all the way to the land of chaos and did not have a chance to inquire about this news. When he arrived at the land of chaos, firstly, it was vast and sparsely populated. Secondly, he deliberately avoided crowds and went to remote and dangerous places, so he really did not have a chance to ask about this matter. He did not expect to hear this news from White Lotus today. No matter what, White Lotus's master was not an ordinary person. He was a divine transformation stage perfected lord who stood at the peak of the human race's martial strength. There were less than 10 of them in the entire world. Every divine transformation stage perfected lord could be said to be a famous authority in the world. Even the slightest movement would attract attention from everywhere, let alone their death. Hakushin Jinkuan's death was undoubtedly a great blow to the strength of the Kunlun party. However, there was a silver lining in the misfortune. The Kunlun party was, after all, a 1,000-year-old sect with a deep foundation. Other than the deceased Hakushin Jinkuan, there was still perfected Lord Tianlan. Otherwise, the death of a perfected lord could directly reduce the strength of a large sect by a level. In addition, there were some differences between the two perfected lords of the Kunlun party. Hakushin Jinkuan had been famous for a long time and was now very old. Even at the level of a perfected lord, he could be considered to have one foot in the grave. On the contrary, his junior brother perfected Lord Tianlan could be considered to be in the prime of his life. Whether it was his body, cultivation, knowledge, temperament, reputation, or so on, he was almost at the peak of his prime. This was also the reason why although Hakushin Jinkuan had died, the foundation of the Kunlun party was not damaged. These thoughts flashed across his mind, but Lu Chen did not show it on his face. He only said to White Lotus, "Your master Hakushin Jinkuan has passed away. This is a huge matter." Why didn't you stay on the mountain of Kunlun to observe your filial piety? Why did you come to the wilderness of the disorienting lands? White Lotus pursed her lips. There was a hint of ridicule on her face, but it wasn't directed at Lu Qin. She casually waved her hand and said, "If he died, then he died. If he really had a filial heart, Master wouldn't care if I kowtowed a few times in front of his coffin. More importantly, if I return to Kunlun Mountain after his death, it's hard to say what will happen to me." Lu Chen's face darkened. He looked at White Lotus and pondered for a moment. Slowly, the light in his eyes gradually brightened. That night, although Lu Chen was also on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, he had brushed past the soul-stirring incident of the Kunlun party. He was like an outsider. At this moment, when he heard White Lotus's words, he seemed to have thought of something. "You seem to suspect the people of the Kunlun party?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus snorted and said, "I'm not an idiot. After the two of us parted that night, I walked towards the winter peak for a while. Even before I reached there, I felt that something was wrong. Then, one after another, I secretly heard that Master died in battle and eldest martial brother was seriously injured and went into closed-door meditation. It would be a joke to say that there's nothing wrong here." Lu Chen nodded slowly. There was a bit of appreciation in his eyes as he looked at this little girl. However, he still couldn't help but say, "Since you feel that something is wrong and don't want to stay on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, you should go back to your hometown, the Bai clan in Kunwa City. There are always your elders and family members there who can take care of you." White Lotus had a disapproving look on her face and even had a trace of contempt. She said, "If someone in the Kunlun party really wants to harm me, you wouldn't think that the Bai clan can handle it, right?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's true. The Bai clan definitely can't handle someone who can arm wrestle with your master and senior martial brother." White Lotus said, "Not only can't they handle it, but there are also no good people in that clan. If someone really forces them too much, maybe that family will turn around and send me there to take credit. I won't go to the Bai clan unless my brain is damaged." Lu Chen looked at her with interest. He only felt that this excessively beautiful little girl seemed to be more and more mysterious and suspicious. He said with a smile, "That's your hometown." "What? From what you see, you also have a lot of dissatisfaction with the Bai clan." White Lotus was about to open her mouth and seemed to want to complain for a while, but she suddenly became alert. She glanced at Lu Chen and coldly snorted, "It's none of your business." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Hey, little girl, don't be so vulgar." White Lotus ignored him and walked straight to Atsu's side. She reached out her hand to touch its head. Today, Atsu was a huge black wolf. Just by standing, it seemed to be taller than White Lotus. But White Lotus didn't look afraid at all. Instead, she was interested in touching the smooth fur on Atsu's head. Atsu's expression was also very strange. He seemed to want to leave, but he also seemed to feel comfortable. He hesitated, but in the end, he still stood there without moving. He probably felt that this mysterious and fierce little girl did not have any hostility towards him. In Kunlun Mountain, the relationship between Lu Chen and White Lotus had always been very subtle. On the surface, they maintained a peaceful relationship. But in private, they had fought to the death several times. Their actions were also extremely ruthless. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were mortal enemies. But now, in the chaotic land far away from Kunlun Mountain, in this dangerous, vast, and sparsely populated wilderness, the atmosphere between the two of them seemed to be a lot more peaceful. At most, they just quarreled a little, but they didn't have the intention to fight anymore. But even so, when Lu Chen was about to leave with Atsu, he saw White Lotus following him calmly as if nothing had happened. He couldn't help but roll his eyes and said, "I say, why do you keep following me?" White Lotus said matter-of-factly, "Tell me the secret of the blood food's secret method, and I won't pester you." Lu Chen sneered and said, "You're just a little girl, but not only do you know the blood food's secret method, you also know so many sinister methods and magical powers. Why don't you tell me the origin of these secrets first?" White Lotus shook her head and said, "I can't tell you." Lu Qin said, then why should I tell you? Besides, this method is originally a plaything of the southern barbarians. It's incompatible with our Central Earth's Tao method and magical powers. Even if you don't know about it, it doesn't matter. Why do you care so much about it? White Lotus wanted to say something but hesitated. She glanced at Lu Qin and shook her head. Why do you always have a belly full of evil tricks? Why do you always try to get information from a little girl like me? Lu Qin laughed and turned around to walk away. He said, if you don't want to tell me, I can't force you. But this chaotic land is full of unfathomable dangers. If we go deeper, even I don't dare to be careless. My life could be in danger at any time. Although you have some skills, you're still a child. You also have a clan in Kunwa City. Why do you need to run here and suffer? If you die here without rhyme or reason, wouldn't it be too unjust? White Lotus thought for a moment but still followed him. She then calmly said, I don't have anyone close to me in my clan. Since I was a child, no one has taken a liking to me. It's just that their temperament suddenly changed after they found out I have the 5-pillar divine disc. It's annoying. In any case, it's rare for me to come out. This carefree life is much more comfortable than living in Kunlun. Lu Qin smiled and said, then why don't you go by yourself? Wouldn't that be more carefree? The world is so big. You can go anywhere and do whatever you want to do. White Lotus shook her head. After a pause, she said in a slightly gloomy voice, after coming out, it seems like you're the only person I know in the whole world. In any case, I have nothing to do. I'll just follow you for a while. Lu Qin was startled. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The words he wanted to say suddenly couldn't come out. He was silent for a moment. Then, he suddenly laughed at himself. He thought to himself that he was indeed much more soft-hearted than the cold and emotionless assassin from 10 years ago. His mood suddenly became somewhat gloomy. However, he felt a little closer to White Lotus. Perhaps it was the loneliness of youth that reminded him of his painful childhood. So, he slowly walked forward, no longer chasing White Lotus away. At the same time, he casually asked, don't you have any close relatives in your family? What about your parents? White Lotus said, they died before I was born. Lu Qin laughed in spite of himself. If they died before you were born, then there wouldn't be you. White Lotus was startled for a moment. Then, she also laughed. Perhaps she also felt that what she said was a little silly. Or perhaps her relationship with her parents was too shallow. So, she shrugged her shoulders and said, I'm wrong. They died before I became sensible. That's why I don't remember what they look like. Do you miss them? Lu Qin pushed away a branch in front of him. He took 2 steps forward. However, he only saw a complex terrain of intersecting mountains and valleys. At the same time, there was a very gloomy and dense forest in front of him. Most of the trees in this forest were dark brown. The trunks were tall and the crowns were luxuriant. However, the strange thing was that there were vines of various sizes hanging everywhere in the forest. Most of them were hanging on the branches of different heights. Many of them were growing on the ground of the forest. But other than that, there wasn't much abnormality. Lu Qin stared at the forest, and his brows suddenly furrowed. At this time, White Lotus also walked to his side and said, I don't miss them. Lu Qin was slightly surprised. He looked at her and said, why? People have feelings for their children. It's natural. No matter what, it's your parents who gave birth to you. Why don't you miss them? White Lotus snorted and said, since they gave birth to me, shouldn't they raise me and take care of me? They didn't have the ability and died early, leaving me to suffer alone. Why should I remember their kindness? Lu Qin thought for a moment and said, perhaps, they also have their difficulties. White Lotus didn't seem to want to talk about this topic anymore. She walked straight forward and said, what difficulties does a dead person have? Chapter 253. Okay. Lu Chen seemed to have finally admitted defeat and gave up the idea of driving White Lotus away. If you want to follow me, then follow me. But I have to say something first. If you encounter any danger, such as a killer suddenly jumping out from the side to attack you, you're on your own. White Lotus stopped and glanced at him. She sneered and said, "Who are you trying to scare?" "Let me tell you, Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly heard a sharp whistling sound. Several figures suddenly rushed out from the nearby forest. They were all dressed in black and held sharp blades in their hands. The sharp blades reflected a cold light that made people tremble with fear. Without saying a word, they directly slashed at him. The attack was extremely fierce. More than half of the attack was aimed at Lu Chen, while the rest was aimed at White Lotus and Atsu. Bai Lian jumped in fright. She tapped the ground with the tip of her foot and quickly retreated. At the same time, she shrieked, "I have nothing to do with him." Before she could finish speaking, the blades were already right in front of her. It was obvious that these black-clothed men were determined to kill everyone here no matter what. White Lotus was so angry that her eyes were on fire, but she could do nothing. After cursing, she suddenly lowered her head and floated back a few feet. At the same time, she waved her hand. In an instant, the surrounding air quickly cooled down. Some frost and snow drifted through her fingertips. Some of the green branches and leaves closest to her actually turned white. As if affected by the sudden cold current, the black-clothed man who was rushing over slowed down for a moment. However, that person seemed to be experienced. He snorted coldly behind the black cloth and shook his arms slightly. In an instant, the icicles and snowflakes that appeared on the blades scattered in all directions and scattered all over the sky. However, the sharp and cold blades still ruthlessly chopped down. It looked like this incomparably beautiful little girl was about to be chopped into two with a single stroke. White Lotus's eyes shone brightly. In an instant, there seemed to be wind and snow drifting through her pupils. Her clothes fluttered even though there was no wind. A cold current flowed out from her body. On the other side, Lu Chen, who had also been surrounded by several black-clothed men, glanced at White Lotus. There was a little surprise in his eyes. He whispered to himself, "Ice Snow Scripture." As expected of a five-pillar genius. This talent is really amazing. There were quite a few more black-robed men surrounding him compared to Bai Lian's group. They were all glaring at Lu Chen like they were about to spit fire. Their hatred was immeasurable, as if every single one of them wanted nothing more than to tear him to shreds. No matter who it was not a comfortable thing to be stared at by so many people with such crazy and hateful gazes. Everyone would feel fear and disgust. However, at this moment, Lu Chen's expression was still expressionless. There was no sadness or joy. It was as if he was an emotionless stone person. This kind of indifferent attitude, in turn, stimulated the black-clothed men around him. In the midst of the angry curses, who knew how many soul-chasing blades of light slashed over? Lu Chen's footsteps were nimble and elegant like the wind. He avoided the attacks of the three people in front of him, but when he retreated, he forgot that there was still someone behind him. The black-clothed man was shocked at first, then delighted. He stabbed forward with his blade, but just as he raised his arm, a huge shadow fell from the sky. It covered his eyes and instantly threw him to the ground. The smell of blood instantly spread. The terrifying and fierce giant wolf suddenly raised its head. Its front legs were still pressing down on the black-clothed man who was struggling desperately on the ground. Dark red blood flowed from its huge mouth. There was a big hole in the black-clothed man's neck. Blood was gushing out. It seemed that it was difficult for him to survive. The surrounding black-clothed men were taken aback. But for these killers who came from the evil cult, it was obvious that this little bit of blood was not enough to scare them away. After a moment, several black-clothed men came together again. This time, even Atsu was surrounded. "Traitor, die!" A shout that seemed to contain a trace of madness rang out from the black-clothed people's mouths. Lu Chen's face was gloomy as he coldly looked at these vicious and valiant killers who were like lunatics. Once upon a time, he was also one of them. Lu Chen's eyes had begun to ignite with black flames. He then walked towards them. The sword swallowed and spat, the black flames crisscrossed. This battle at the edge of the Black Forest lasted for about half an hour. The final result was that the black-clothed men left behind a few corpses. The rest of them retreated. Lu Chen's side was not good either. There were 3 more wounds on his body. Blood was flowing. Even the wounds that were almost healed a few days ago were either broken again or were scratched with new wounds. In contrast, although White Lotus's situation looked a little embarrassing, it was better than Lu Chen's. At least she was not seriously injured. Her face was a little pale. She stood in the same place and gasped for breath. It seemed that she had exhausted all her strength. That was the manifestation of a large amount of spiritual power consumption. Compared to these 2 people, Black Wolf Atsu was obviously better. There was almost no injury on its body. Not even a knife wound could be seen. Probably those black-clothed men focused on Lu Chen and White Lotus, so they did not have time to greet it. After the battle, Lu Chen sat tiredly on a tree stump that had been cut by one of the black-clothed men just now. This time, the black-clothed men's cultivation was not low and their combat power was high. It was just that they did not quite understand Lu Chen's strange black flame technique. They suffered a lot in the battle just now. However, Lu Chen felt that if he waited until the next assassination, the power of the black flame would probably be reduced. "Hey, why are you like this?" There was an angry complaint from the front. Needless to say, it was White Lotus. Her beautiful and moving little face was full of anger as she said, "A bunch of people randomly jump out from the side to kill you. You're like a madman. You even implicated me." Even though Lu Chen was exhausted, he still laughed loudly when he heard this and said, "Didn't I tell you just now? Don't regret it if you follow me. But seeing that we've both stayed on the Kunlun Mountains, I'll give you a word of advice. These people are all madmen. They have no qualms about killing people. Otherwise, you'd better leave me. At least you can live a little longer." White Lotus snorted. Her expression was a little strange. After looking at Lu Chen for a while, she suddenly said, "You really are a jinx." Lu Chen said, "Everything is fine. Why are you scolding people?" White Lotus said, "If not, why did you implicate EXIN to die?" Lu Chen's body shook. The smile on his face slowly disappeared. He seemed to have something to say. But in the end, he remained silent. After a bitter laugh, he shook his head and did not speak again. After being suddenly stabbed by White Lotus's cold words, Lu Chen became much quieter. He did not say a word for a long time. As a result, the atmosphere between the 2 people and the wolf suddenly became stiff. However, Atsu did not seem to care. It was still sniffing around. It seemed that it was not at ease with its surroundings. Lu Chen whistled, and Atsu ran to his side. Lu Chen gestured for it to squat down, and then he climbed onto it. Then, he rode on the black wolf and began to move forward. White Lotus's eyes instantly lit up. The way she looked at Atsu suddenly changed. After a while, she ran over and said loudly, "I want to sit too." "Let me sit too." Atsu growled. It seemed to be unwilling. Lu Chen also waved his hand and said, "Go, go, go. I was injured. In order to recover as soon as possible, I let Atsu carry me temporarily." "How are you injured? Why are you joining in the fun? Go away." White Lotus said indignantly, "Hey. Don't turn your back on me so quickly. At least I helped you to stop 2 men in black just now, okay? Besides, if it wasn't for my skills and the magical power of ice and snow that my dead master taught me, wouldn't I be dead now? How could I help you win this battle? It's already like this, and you still won't let me ride this black dog, wolf?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Atsu has its own intelligence. It has its own decision in its heart." After saying that, he lowered his head and patted Atsu's head. He said, "Atsu, are you going to let her come up?" As he said that, he pointed at White Lotus. Atsu looked at the direction he was pointing at. It barked twice and then shook its head like a child playing with a rattle drum. White Lotus was very angry, but there was nothing she could do. She could only scold this stupid dog, no, Black Wolf, and then followed the two of them forward. Along the way, Lu Chen would pat Atsu's head from time to time, indicating the direction it should go. Unconsciously or unconsciously, he avoided the strange dark brown forest. At the same time, not far away from him, because Lu Chen was riding the wolf and White Lotus was walking, her body looked even smaller. But White Lotus did not have much opinion on this. She seemed to have calmed down from her initial anger. She said to Lu Chen, "I have something to ask you." Lu Chen declined to comment and said, "Say it." White Lotus said, "Why did you suddenly sense the pursuers so keenly?" She stared at him and said, "This is not quite right. You always seem to know something about the evil sect in advance." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "You misunderstood. The reason why I know a little about the evil sect is actually because I once stayed in the evil sect for a period of time." White Lotus thought for a moment and said, "If that's the case, no wonder those evil sect people shouted at you like a traitor." Lu Chen smiled bitterly and did not want to continue this topic. At the same time, he also turned around and stared at the road he came from. His face showed a trace of doubt. Previously, he had purposely chosen this inaccessible path. He had even risked encountering the savage and terrifying barbarian tribes in the land of chaos in order to avoid being hunted down by both the righteous and devil Dao. But, why after so many days, those evil sect killers still seemed to be able to clearly find his whereabouts? This matter made people feel that there was something strange about it. Chapter 254. "There's something I must ask you," Lu Chen suddenly stopped and said to White Lotus, "If you don't make it clear, we can't stay together." White Lotus glanced at him and said, "You look like you're interrogating a criminal, what is it?" "Although I have fought with you a few times, but until now I have not really let you down. I am just a little girl, you are a man, what are you afraid of? I really don't understand." Saying that, she shook her head repeatedly, looking as if she did not agree. Lu Chen was not moved at all, he did not pay attention to her changing the topic, only stared at her and said, "On the night of the full moon, why did you go to that forest?" White Lotus snorted and said, "I was bored, so I went to play, why? Can't I?" Lu Chen indifferently said, "There was such a heavy storm, why did you go to that dark forest to play?" White Lotus's mouth twitched, but she turned her head and said, "None of your business." Lu Chen did not ask further, turned and walked away, said, "It doesn't matter if I don't care, but you don't need to follow." White Lotus looked back and saw Lu Chen and Atsu had really left on their own, neat and tidy, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. She could not help but be angered, her figure flashed and floated in front of them, stretched out her hand to block Lu Chen's way, angrily said, "I just want to follow you." "What do you want? How can you be so petty? At least when the evil faction tried to assassinate you, I helped you to hold back a few killers, why are you so quick to turn your back on me? If you didn't help me in front of the evil faction killers, I wouldn't even ask you these questions." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "It's not that I'm petty, it's that the identity of the people who went to that forest that night is not a small matter, I must find out. If you don't tell me, then I can't go with you. If you insist on following me, then I can only fight with you, and then both of us will be injured and go our separate ways. That's it." White Lotus was stunned for a moment. She still didn't quite understand, but she saw that Lu Chen's expression was unusually firm. He didn't seem to be joking, nor did he show any signs of relenting. The expression on her face fluctuated. After a while, she said, "All right, I'm here to look for you." Lu Chen's gaze suddenly turned cold as he looked at White Lotus and said coldly, "You are from the Three Realms Demon Sect?" "What? Of course not." White Lotus cried out, looking angry and aggrieved. "No matter what, I'm a five-pillar genius who was accepted by a soul formation perfected lord, all right? I'm not a fool to join a fiend cult for no reason." Lu Chen stared at her for a moment. Then, he slowly nodded. His expression softened a little. What you said makes sense. Then, he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, but to be honest, there are actually those kinds of fools. What? White Lotus didn't hear clearly and asked. Oh, nothing. Lu Chen waved his hand. Then, he sternly asked, why did you look for me that night? Also, how did you know that I was in that forest and find me? Speaking up to hear, Lu Chen's expression turned serious. These days, he had been repeatedly recalling the process of that full moon night. Other than perfected Lord Tianlan going back on his words and not going outside, what surprised and puzzled him the most was the sudden appearance of White Lotus. This little girl seemed to be filled with countless secrets, making it hard for people to see her true face. White Lotus looked a little reluctant. It seemed that she didn't want to say it, but under Lu Chen's determined gaze, she finally shrugged and said, I can feel your position. Lu Chen's body shook. A trace of astonishment flashed across his face. He said, my position. Are you sure? Haven't you always been interested in Atu? I had already believed that you were probably able to sense the location of this stupid dog because of the secret of blood feeding, this kind of messy southern barbarian sorcery. Roar! Atu roared from the side and bared his teeth. His expression was ferocious as he looked at White Lotus with an unfriendly gaze. White Lotus was angry. She spat at the guy who looked like a giant wolf and scolded, it's Lu Chen who scolded you. What are you yelling at me for? Are you bullying the weak and afraid of the strong? Atsu wagged its tail and leaned against Lu Chen. It seemed to be saying, don't try to drive a wedge between us, woman. White Lotus shook her head. She was too lazy to care about the strange black dog. She said to Lu Chen seriously, now that things have come to this, it seems that I can only tell you the truth. In fact, what I can feel is not this stupid dog, but your position. You have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you, and it always resonates with my pendant. As she said, she reached into her chest and turned over her clothes. She took out a pendant. It was the branch of the tree of God that Lu Chen had seen that day. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. After White Lotus said those words, she kept staring at Lu Chen's expression. At the same time, she stared at him, waiting for him to speak. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen just frowned and did not speak for a long time. She could not see anything and felt a little unhappy. He said, this branch of the tree of God is definitely a rare treasure in this world. It's one of a kind, so I want to know why you have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you. Lu Chen was speechless. At this time, he of course understood. As for why he had the breath of the branch of the tree of God on him, the answer was also obvious. It was naturally the mysterious tree hole that accidentally brought the unconscious White Lotus into the seed. As a result, the ancient tree hole absorbed abundant spiritual power from the branch of the tree of God and changed. The most obvious and most mysterious change was that, on the tree wall that was covered by the green mist in the tree hole, the shape of two doorways appeared. The tree of God was a holy object that was worshipped and revered by the Three Realms divine sect. When Lu Chen first sneaked into the devil sect, he did not really believe in this thing. However, later on, he found out that the legendary, one branch, two leaves, one seed really existed. Moreover, by chance, he also secretly obtained the most important seed. The seed of the tree of God and the branch of the tree of God came from the same source. If something magical happened between the two of them, it would not be too strange. However, from then on, White Lotus could suddenly feel his own position. This was a very troublesome thing. While he was calculating, White Lotus asked, I've been thinking about it for a long time. I didn't feel anything like this when I first saw you. It was only after I fainted that you started to have this aura. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but look at White Lotus. He thought to himself, this little girl looks young, but her mind is really exquisite, crystal clear, and extremely smart. It is as if she has a telepathic connection with me and thought of the same thing at once. White Lotus looked at Lu Chen and snorted coldly. Did you do something when I was unconscious? That's why the power of the branch of the tree of God was a little difficult to control after I woke up. There's no such thing. Lu Chen shook his head very straightforwardly and lied to the girl without blushing. Then he said, could it be that you found something wrong with the branch of the tree of God? White Lotus gritted her teeth and looked a little distressed. That's the problem. The treasure itself didn't seem to have any problems. But why did you suddenly have this kind of breath? Lu Chen relaxed and laughed. Maybe it's because you used the power of the tree of God to attack me that day. After I was injured, I got a little smell. You can't blame me for this. White Lotus looked doubtful and looked at Lu Chen suspiciously. She probably felt that this man's words couldn't be completely trusted. But at the moment, she couldn't say anything. After all, there was nothing wrong with the branch of the tree of God. Lu Chen put down the stone in his heart and felt much more relaxed. He turned around and continued to walk forward. At the same time, he said to White Lotus, then according to what you said, you were able to find me in this disorienting lands because of the breath of the branch of the tree of God? White Lotus said, yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to catch up to you. You're as cunning as a loach. If I were someone else, I probably wouldn't have been able to catch up to you. Lu Chen chuckled. His face was expressionless, but at the same time, he snorted in his heart. That's right. Logically speaking, he should have shaken off his pursuers. Why were they able to catch up to him? Several of our hall's most powerful experts who specialize in tracking have already entered the disorienting lands. No matter how He Lang tries to evade, he shouldn't be able to escape from their pursuit. At the foot of Kunlun Mountain, in Kunwa City, inside the Black Hill Pavilion in a secluded alley, Old Ma expressionlessly leaned against the wall of the hand-wrapping corridor. He looked at the two people in the courtyard. One was a bald fatty with an unusually tall and sturdy figure. Even though he was just sitting, he seemed taller than the charming and beautiful woman standing in front of him. When Old Ma's gaze fell on the woman again, there was a trace of deeply concealed fear in his eyes. She was Shuang, the leader of Zengxian Mengfuyunji. She had been in this position for 10 years. Once, he and Lu Chen could be considered as people who lived under her protection and lived in seclusion to avoid calamity. At this moment, when she said these words to true Lord Tianlan, her expression was calm. It was as if she was talking about an ordinary matter that had nothing to do with her. There was no joy or anger on true Lord Tianlan's face. There was only calmness. After a while, true Lord Tianlan suddenly shook his head and said, not necessarily. Shuang was a little surprised. She raised her head and looked at true Lord Tianlan. She frowned and said, but, isn't He Lang almost a cripple? True Lord Tianlan closed his eyes and didn't say anything. Shuang waited for a while and didn't dwell on this issue. She said, I came here this time to ask you to tell me how we should treat He Lang in the future. At this moment, Old Ma, who was standing to the side, unconsciously straightened his body. His gaze also quietly fell on true Lord Tianlan's face. There was a moment of silence in the courtyard. Shuang slowly asked, word by word, should we release him or kill him? Chapter 255. Should he be let go, or should he be killed? Shuang spoke very slowly. Although her expression was still calm, there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes as she stared unblinkingly at true Lord Tianlan. Old Ma, who was in the corridor, seemed to be holding his breath as he looked nervously at the fatty sitting in the courtyard. True Lord Tianlan was silent for a while, then said lightly, don't worry about him, let him be. Shuang nodded and agreed. Old Ma, who was beside her, let out a long sigh and wiped his forehead with his hand. True Lord Tianlan's gaze seemed to inadvertently sweep over the corridor, but it quickly moved away. He looked at Shuang and said, mobilize the people from the disorienting lands and send them back to the immortal city in several batches. You also go back there to oversee things and prepare carefully. In about half a year to a year, I will send out the heaven token. Shuang had been very calm all along. Even when it came to dealing with He Lang, she did not show any change in her expression. However, when she suddenly heard the words heaven token, her body shook violently. She could not help but ask True Lord Tianlan, "My lord, are you talking about the heavens token?" True Lord Tianlan nodded and did not say anything. Shuang lowered her head, as if she knew that she had lost her composure. However, after taking a deep breath, her expression had already calmed down. There was even a hint of excitement in her eyes. True Lord Tianlan saw the change in Shui Ying's expression but did not say anything. After a while, Shui Ying asked carefully, "My lord, about the reorganization of Fuyunji that you mentioned before, let's begin." True Lord Tianlan did not hesitate and said straightforwardly, "Just do as I told you before. The immortal city has basically been arranged, you just need to follow the plan. I still need to reorganize the Kunlun party for a while, but it should not take too long. When the time comes, I will come and tell you." "My lord is wise." Shuang bowed deeply. At this moment, the face of this charming and beautiful woman did not seem to have the usual fierceness. Instead, there was a bit of heartfelt admiration. However, perfected Lord Tianlan was probably the only person in this world who could make a woman like her have such an expression. After a while, when all that needed to be said was said, Shuang bade farewell and left. Supreme Lord Tianlan naturally sat there without moving. It was old Ma who sent Shuang out of the deserted Black Hill Pavilion. Just as she was about to step out of the door, Shuang suddenly stopped and turned to look at old Ma. Shui Ying's expression was different from her previous humble and obedient demeanor in front of True Lord Tianlan in the courtyard. At this moment, Shui Ying's expression had returned to her usual self. The sharpness hidden in her beautiful face seemed to be released once again as she looked indifferently at old Ma. Old Ma stepped aside and quietly lowered his head. "Old Ma," Blood Oriole called out. "I'm here," replied Old Ma. "How long have you been with Hei Lang?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but still answered honestly, "More than 10 years. If we count from the time when he was still in the devil cult, then even earlier." Shuang hummed and said, "You are also an old person in Fuyunji. Moreover, Hei Lang's identity is special. Back then, even I could not ask about him. Only you and Supreme could contact him. What do you think of this person?" Old Ma was silent for a moment, then said, "It doesn't matter what I think. The most important thing is what Supreme and you plan to do. As long as there is an order, we, as subordinates, will naturally follow it." Shuang stared at him for a moment, then nodded and left without saying anything else. After watching the charming yet vaguely fierce woman leave, old Ma stood alone for a while before returning to the backyard. Supreme Tianlan was still sitting in the same place. At this moment, he was looking up at the sky. Old Ma walked to his side and stood there. He also looked up and saw a dark cloud floating in the small sky above his head. "Do you blame me?" Supreme Lord Tianlan suddenly asked. Old Ma shook his head and said, "No, it was Hei Lang who couldn't get over it and insisted on walking down the road of no return. It's not your fault." Supreme Tianlan snorted and shook his head without saying anything. Old Ma continued, "That night, on the long street of Kunwa City, I already told him everything that should be said. Hei Lang himself should know how serious the consequences of his actions were and how troublesome it would be." Supreme Tianlan was silent for a long time before he said, "After staying in the devil cult for a long time, his temperament has probably changed." Old Ma's body trembled slightly and he subconsciously blurted out, "But he's absolutely respectful and loyal to you." Supreme Tianlan turned to look at Old Ma. That gaze was calm and emotionless, but it seemed as heavy as a mountain. At that moment, Old Ma felt as if the entire Kunlun mountain was pressing down on his shoulders and back, making him feel suffocated. He almost knelt down. Fortunately, this feeling disappeared in the blink of an eye. In the end, he clenched his teeth and endured it. But after a while, the back of his clothes was already wet. After a while, Supreme Tianlan seemed to be a little dispirited and said, "Forget it. Anyway, it's already like this. Let him be. I don't know if he really came back from the land of chaos alive." Shuang went all the way out of Kunwa city and came to a secluded place outside the city. There were already people from Fuyunji waiting for her, and they welcomed her. Shuang ordered people to stand guard outside while she walked alone to a quiet place. She then took out a bright yellow talisman from her bosom and directly lit it up. This was the highest grade sound talisman, and each one was extremely valuable. But compared to the secret treasure of the Kunlun party, the Wind Whisper disc, it was naturally still a bit inferior. But sound talismans were more convenient and easy to use. Although there were some limitations, such as the fact that two people couldn't communicate with each other and could only transmit a single message, over the years, sound talismans were still quite popular among the higher-ups of Zhengxianmeng. As the fire lit up, several magnificent spirit lights flickered, forming a ring that kept rotating. Shui Ying's expression was solemn as she said to the ring of spirit lights, "Give up on the pursuit and return to the immortal city." As soon as she finished speaking, the magnificent ring of spirit lights suddenly trembled with incomparable intensity. There were faint tiny waves of air in the air that rushed towards the surroundings with incomparable speed, faintly emitting ear-piercing whistling sounds. This continued for a little less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea before it gradually calmed down. Then, the ring of spirit lights disappeared, and the sound talisman was completely burnt at this moment. Shuang swung her hand, and the last bit of ash fell from her white palm and floated in the wind. At the same time, in the faraway land of chaos, in a river valley that was blooming with a large expanse of bright flowers, a similar sound talisman was also burning in the hand of a woman in red. The strange ring of light flickered with a magnificent luster, flashing on her fingertips, causing her beautiful face to become a little bright red, as if she was a little excited. The woman in red stood in the river valley not too far away from the bloodthirsty demon flowers. If there were people familiar with the strange and cruel habits of these demon flowers, they would probably be able to see that she just happened to be standing on the edge of that invisible boundary. If she just went a little further, the bloodthirsty demon flowers would be alarmed, and they would start hunting for food. Under the clear sky, this scene of a beautiful woman and a beautiful flower was really beautiful, but in the dark, danger lurked everywhere, and life and death were only an inch away. Further away in the river valley, there were quite a few people standing. These people seemed to be wearing different clothes, but each of them was valiant and capable. They were all part of the elites of this hall in Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji. For so many years, the devil cult had been on the decline, and Zhengxianmeng had been peaceful for a long time. Only Fuyunji, a hall that specialized in dealing with the devil cult, had all kinds of powerful people. At that moment, the red-clothed woman was looking at the ring of spiritual light in her hand the entire time. As for the surrounding people, they had all made way for her. All of them were quite a distance away from her. Evidently, this red-clothed woman's status in the floating clouds department was not low. After a short moment, the spirit light ring suddenly shook violently, and dazzling light flickered. Immediately after, a sentence came out of the light. It was unexpectedly the same sentence that Shuang had said through the sound transmission talisman outside Kunwa City in the Western continent. This voice wasn't loud, and only the woman in red standing next to the spirit light ring could hear it clearly. After hearing this sentence, she nodded slightly, then flicked her finger. The sound transmission talisman floated up and burned, scattering like dust on the ground behind her. She turned around and walked towards the entrance of the river valley. At the same time, she waved her hands, and the people in the surroundings of Fuyunji quickly gathered around her. "Miss Hong, did Hall Master Shuang send an order?" someone asked from the side. The woman in red, who was addressed as Miss Hong, smiled and nodded. "Yes, Sister Shuang sent me a message just now. She has given me instructions on this matter." Speaking up to here, she paused for a moment, then continued, "You all probably know that she has been in the western continent's Kunlun mountain for the past few days, so this order is most likely the order of that true monarch Tian Lan above us." The people around her immediately became restless. Even in Zhengxianmeng, the largest power in the cultivation world, a soul formation true monarch was still an unreachable existence. It was enough to make people feel awe and respect. Not to mention that true monarch Tian Lan was actually the legendary figure who founded Fuyunji. For so many years, he had always led Fuyunji to fight against the devil cult. He was a godlike figure in the hearts of almost everyone present, an existence that was a level higher than the other true monarchs in Zhengxianmeng. Seeing the expressions on everyone's faces and eyes, the woman in red smiled with satisfaction and said, "So everyone must do your best to follow this order. Don't be lazy." Everyone burst into laughter. Someone laughed and said, "Who dares to be lazy? Isn't Miss Hong here to watch? What order is it? Just say it." The woman in red nodded and smiled. Then, her expression suddenly became solemn. She said, "Receiving the order from Hall Master, we will use all our strength to chase after the devil cult's black wolf. When we find him, we will kill him without mercy." Chapter 256. Why don't we go through that forest? Wouldn't it be faster to go through from there? In the disorienting land, White Lotus asked Lu Chen, pointing at the dark brown forest in front of them. By this time, Lu Chen had already called Atu back to his side. He flipped himself over and climbed up. At this moment, his old injuries had not yet healed and he had suffered new injuries. He really needed to rest, so he did not hide in front of White Lotus anymore. After hearing White Lotus's question, he just glanced in that direction and said lightly, "That is the snake forest. It likes to eat young girls with soft skin and tender flesh like you. If you want to go, you go, I won't go." After saying that, he lightly patted Atsu's head and walked towards the path beside the snake forest. It seemed that he intended to take a big detour. White Lotus looked at the snake forest a few more times, but no matter how she looked, she couldn't see anything strange about the forest. At most, the color of the trees was darker and there were more vines in the forest, but she didn't feel any danger. However, people were strange. Previously, no matter how she looked at the forest, she felt that there was nothing wrong with it. But after Lu Chen's words, White Lotus looked for a while and suddenly felt that the forest seemed to suddenly become dark. Sure enough, there was some inexplicable murderous aura seeping out, making people feel a chill in their hearts. What the hell, pretending to be mysterious all day, I don't even know if it's real or fake. White Lotus complained in a low voice, but after hesitating for a while, she still didn't dare to go in. She immediately turned around and followed behind Lu Chen. But after just 2 steps, her eyes lit up, and her attention suddenly turned from the snake forest to another target. Looking at Lu Chen and Atsu, she suddenly jumped in front of them, her eyes shining, and said with slight surprise, "Hey, this stupid dog can actually be used as a mount? Only those who are about to die from injuries have the right to sit." Lu Chen said lazily. He then laid on Atsu's body as if he had lost all his strength. He patted its head and said, "Let's go, Atsu. I don't know when our pursuers will come after us again." Atsu let out a low growl and stepped forward. White Lotus didn't give up. It could be seen that she was very interested in Atsu as a mount. She kept pestering it with words, wanting to ride it as well. After all, the mount was this mighty and majestic big black wolf, a ferocious and domineering demonic beast. Ordinary people rarely had the chance to ride it. Lu Chen was annoyed by her pestering. He rolled his eyes and said, "Don't talk nonsense. I told you just now that Atsu is not for anyone to ride. If you don't believe me, you can ask him." White Lotus immediately ran in front of Atsu. She looked very excited. At a glance, she really looked like a 10-year-old child. Lu Chen shook his head as he watched from the side. This girl Bai Lian was truly strange. Sometimes she seemed as innocent and pure as a young girl, but sometimes she was mature and ruthless to a frightening degree. Just how did she grow up all these years? Atu snorted disdainfully at White Lotus, who approached him with a smile on his face. Yes, he really snorted and continued to walk forward, as if he was ignoring White Lotus. White Lotus was furious. She stamped her feet and said, "Stupid dog, how dare you treat me like this? Do you believe that I won't kill you?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "What? If I don't listen to you and don't do what you want to hurt me? Where did you learn to be so overbearing at such a young age?" White Lotus glared at him. Her beautiful little face tightened, as if she was about to retort. But for some reason, she suddenly thought of something and became silent. After a while, she said, "If you don't want to give it to me, then don't give it to me. You make it sound like I want it very much." After saying that, she turned her head and walked forward. Who knew that after 2 steps, Lu Chen's cold and sarcastic laughter came from behind. He said, "TSK TSK, your temper is quite big. If you really have such a backbone, don't follow me. Don't you know that this is also very annoying?" White Lotus suddenly turned around and stared at Lu Chen. Her face turned pale for some reason, and a murderous intent faintly emerged from her clear eyes. Atsu immediately stopped and growled. The hair on his neck slowly stood up. Obviously, he also felt some danger. Lu Chen looked the calmest. He looked at White Lotus and said with a smile, "What? Did I say something wrong? Did I hurt your heart? Or, did I say something that made you uncomfortable? Let me think. Maybe it's that annoying word." He looked at White Lotus, his face calm but a bit cold. He said, "It seems that someone has said this to you before, right? Since you were young, when you heard this sentence, did you also feel especially scared? Or when someone said this sentence, you once?" "Enough." Suddenly, White Lotus shouted. Her eyes widened and stared at Lu Chen. She said coldly, "Has anyone ever told you that you are really a repulsive person?" "No." Lu Chen said, "No one has said that to me." White Lotus sneered and said, "Then you heard it now. Even if you want me to leave your side so that I won't be a burden to you, I still have to say that you are simply a scum. The most ruthless thing I have done is to see blood, but you trample on people's hearts. You poke out the secrets in other people's hearts, spread them out, and then step on the ground. Is it fun?" Lu Chen's face did not change. He said calmly, "You think too much." The corners of White Lotus' lips curled into a mocking smile. "Sometimes, I really feel happy for Exian. Fortunately, she died a long time ago. Otherwise, if she were to be entangled with you in the future, I'm afraid she would be in even more pain and sorrow. That pain would be far worse than it is now." Lu Chen's face finally changed and became cold. He slowly sat up straight on the back of Atsu. He stared at White Lotus and said coldly, "If you have something to say, come at me. Don't drag Exian into it." White Lotus sneered and said, "Pretentious. Do you dare to say that Exian didn't run into bad luck after she met you?" Lu Chen's face became colder. But for some reason, there was suddenly a trace of hidden guilt in the depths of his eyes. After a few words, White Lotus seemed to feel better. After sneering a few times, she turned around and strode away. Watching her gradually walking away, Lu Chen's cold face gradually eased. After a while, he suddenly smiled bitterly. Atsu turned around and looked at him. Lu Chen sighed and said, "We are both in the same predicament. We originally planned to go together. But in the end, she and I are like each holding a knife, desperately stabbing each other's heart. We won't stop until we see blood. Isn't this stupid?" "Woof." Atsu nodded solemnly. "Get lost." Lu Chen kicked him. White Lotus left Lu Chen and Atsu and walked alone in another direction. Her heart was full of resentment and anger. She had long cursed that hateful man. Such a rotten person deserves to be hunted down, deserves to be hacked into 1,000 pieces, so as not to harm people anymore. He should just die. Bai Lian gritted her teeth as she muttered to herself. After walking a long distance away, she stood still for a while. After a while, she suddenly turned around and looked behind her, but there was nothing behind her. Not a single person could be seen. Furthermore, there was no sign of anyone in the distance. They had probably left already. White Lotus was so angry that her face turned pale. She clenched her hands tightly. If Lu Chen was standing in front of her now, she might really poke a few bloody holes in his body. Since she was young, White Lotus had a cold and quiet appearance in front of most people. But in reality, when there was no one behind her, this little girl's temperament had already gone to the extreme. She was the most intense and sensitive. And because of this, she had those cruel and bloody methods. Even Atsu was a little afraid of her. However, although she looked like a little crazy, she was not a completely crazy person. Although she was really angry this time, she still cursed a few times in the end. After cursing for a while, she turned around and left hatefully. It would be best if you died in this chaotic place and never returned to the outside world, Bai Lian muttered to herself as she walked forward. There was no obvious path in front of her. Lu Chen had chosen the wilderness that almost no one had been to before. There were no signs of human habitation along the way. White Lotus identified the direction. Just as she was about to take a step forward, she hesitated. She followed Lu Chen here because of the secret of the Atsu's blood food. But no matter how important this secret was, it was actually not necessary for her. Most of the time, it was because she really had nowhere to go. A 10-year-old little girl stood in the middle of the vast world. She looked around. It was desolate. There was nowhere to go. There was no one to see. She was like a lonely bird flying alone in the cold. She felt an inexplicable sense of panic and fear. She stood in a daze for a while. Then she walked forward. But after a few steps, her body suddenly trembled and she stopped. She frowned and looked forward. Behind a tree in front of her, an old man suddenly walked out. His face was very familiar. It was actually Zhuo Xian. Junior sister, long time no see. Zhuo Xian looked very calm. It was as if he had not seen her for a long time. He then said to White Lotus, I'm here to bring you home. Chapter 257. He had traveled thousands of miles from Kunlun Mountain to this place, yet he had suddenly appeared here. This pair of martial brother and sister, who had once enjoyed limitless glory on Mount Kunlun and in the Kunlun party, appeared to be very different in age, almost like grandfather and grandson. However, this did not affect their status at all. This was because not long ago, they had even lived together on the winter peak among the clouds of the Kunlun party. They were both disciples of that deity transformation true Lord. However, in the blink of an eye, the world had changed. The true Lord had fallen, and the winter peak had been destroyed. The once flourishing Bai Chen's branch had instantly fallen, leaving behind only a scene of desolation. Among the rubble that was still piled up like a mountain under the clouds of the sky, there were still some remnants of their former glory. Now, in this desolate land of confusion, Zhuo Xian and White Lotus looked at each other. For a moment, they both felt an inexplicable sense of desolation and absurdity. After a while, White Lotus said, Bring me back. Zhuo Xian nodded and said, Yes, the Kunlun party is your home. White Lotus sneered and said, Second senior brother, it's fine if you said that in the past, but now you can still say it so openly. I'm also very impressed. Zhuo Xian's expression did not change, as if he did not hear the sarcasm in White Lotus's words. He said, Little junior sister, what I said is true. It's really too dangerous for you to wander the world at such a young age. Why don't you come back with me? As long as your cultivation is successful in the future, there is no place in this vast world that you can't go to whenever you want. White Lotus stared at Zhuo Xian and suddenly said, Where will I stay when I go back? Zhuo Xian was startled and said, What? White Lotus said, I'm used to living in the winter peak. I don't want to stay anywhere else. Zhuo Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. Little junior sister, the winter peak has already been destroyed. White Lotus sneered, Why don't you go back and plead for me to stay on Summer Peak for a few days? Zhuo Xian still appeared to be calm and collected. He did not seem to be angry at White Lotus's unreasonable pestering. He said gently, The Summer Peak is the sacred place of martial Uncle Tianlan's abode of immortal caves. Aside from him, no one in the entire sect can go there. I'm afraid I can't do that. This won't do, that won't do. What's the point of me going back? White Lotus waved her hand and said, I won't go back. Second senior brother, you go back first and send my regards to eldest senior brother. Ask him to recuperate from his injuries and come back as soon as possible to restore the prestige of the sect. When the time comes, I will go back and rely on him. What do you say? Zhuo shook his head and said, that won't do. Eldest senior brother is in seclusion to recuperate. No one knows how long it will take for him to come out. It might even be a few years or even a dozen years. Don't tell me you won't return to the mountain for such a long time. White Lotus gritted her teeth and looked at Zhuo without saying a word. Zhuo also looked at her calmly. They looked at each other for a long time, and the atmosphere seemed to suddenly become cold. After an unknown period of time, Bai Lian suddenly seemed to be tired of this hypocritical game of words. She snorted and said with a face full of disgust, second senior brother, can we not be so fake? Zhuo sighed and still didn't speak. White Lotus said coldly, you said that you will take me back. It sounds nice to say that it's going home, but in fact, after I go back, I may have to go into seclusion for decades like eldest senior brother, right? Zhuo was silent for a moment and said, little junior sister, you are born with 5 pillars and are a rare cultivation genius. Martial Uncle Tianlan is a person who loves talents. Maybe he will put the foundation of the sect first and cultivate you well. Bullshit. Do you believe that yourself? White Lotus scolded him bitterly. Zhuo opened his mouth and then suddenly smiled. He sighed and said, actually, I really want to believe it. He looked at White Lotus and his face suddenly showed a trace of sincerity. He said, little junior sister, you see, if I don't even believe what I say, how can I make others believe it? What nonsense are you talking about? I don't understand. What I mean is, whether you believe it or not, I believe it myself. Zhuo said gently and then walked towards White Lotus. At the same time, he said, little junior sister, listen to second senior brother, it's better to go back to the mountain with me. The land of chaos is in chaos and there will be a massacre soon. It's very dangerous for you to stay here. White Lotus took a step back and looked somewhat guarded. At the same time, she slightly raised her brows and said, what did you say? There is chaos and a massacre is about to happen. What do you mean? Zhuo did not answer and only walked closer. White Lotus's face darkened. Suddenly, she let out a soft whistle and her body flew backwards. However, even though her movements were extremely fast, in the blink of an eye, Zhuo body had moved like a ghost and at the same time, he reached out to grab White Lotus's wrist. White Lotus was shocked and could not help but look at this second senior brother in a different light. In the past, in Hakushin Jinkuin's faction, Hakushin Jinkuin's position was needless to say. Among the 3 disciples, Spiritual Master Idol Month was a great spiritual master of the Yuanying realm and also the sect leader of the Kunlun sect. Her status and cultivation were all top-notch. As for the 3rd disciple, White Lotus, although she entered the sect late and was young, her innate talent was too strong. She was publicly recognized as a rare talent. At such a young age, she could already look forward to the Yuanying realm and then pull the upper limit to the divine transformation realm. Because of this, White Lotus was also very famous among the elites of the Kunlun party. After all, how many years had it been since the Kunlun party had produced such a genius? In comparison, although Hakushin Jinkuin's 2nd disciple, Zhuo was also a veteran of the Jin Dan Friar sect and was publicly recognized as a person of virtue and virtue, in terms of fame, he was not as famous as senior brother Idol Month's spiritual master. Recently, even Zhuo little junior sister was not as famous. Of course, this was a very depressing matter. However, things were often like this in the world. There was not much reason to talk about. In addition, Zhuo had always been low-key and did not want to be in the limelight, so his presence was not strong. Even White Lotus herself, although she was usually taken care of by this second senior brother, in her heart, compared to her incomparably powerful master and eldest senior brother, she still looked down on this second senior brother. Those who did things and took care of others did not have much respect. Those who were high and mighty and did not manage things were instead respected. This was probably the way of the world nowadays. However, no matter how much White Lotus looked down on Zhuoxian, now that they had really started to fight, Zhuoxian, the veteran Jean Dan Friar's sex official second disciple, still instantly displayed a shockingly powerful strength. No matter how White Lotus tried to break through, Zhuoxian was always one step ahead and blocked in front of her, making it impossible for her to leave. White Lotus used more than 10 methods of movement, but still could not break through Zhuoxian's obstruction. Her heart became more and more shocked. She even faintly felt that there was indeed a saying, "There is always someone better than you in the world." Although this was a very reasonable old saying, once she had this kind of feeling, there was no doubt that her self-confidence had already suffered a heavy blow. Finally, after dodging once again, Zhuoxian suddenly reached out and grabbed White Lotus's right wrist. He calmly said, "Little junior sister, stop fooling around. Follow me back to Kunlun Mountain." As he spoke, he slightly exerted force in his hand. Instantly, his palm was like an iron lock, clasping onto White Lotus's small hand. If he took another step forward, he would use his incomparably vigorous spiritual power to overwhelm this little girl. At this moment, Zhuoxian suddenly heard White Lotus sneer and say, "You are so arrogant now. Aren't you afraid that when I cultivate to the soul formation stage in the future, I will turn around and dismember your body into 1,000 pieces?" Zhuoxian's body trembled slightly, and his eyes were also a little stunned. One must know that White Lotus's talent was really too good. When others said that Yuanying and soul formation stage might be boasting, there was a very high chance that what she said would come true. To be remembered and hated by a future soul formation true monarch from now on. Even though Zhuoxian had always been calm and collected, at this moment, he couldn't help but have cold sweat on his forehead and his hair stood on end. However, at least he was not an ordinary person. No matter what, he was still a disciple that had been taught by Hakushin Jinkuan for many years. How could he be scared out of his wits just because of a few words? This five-pillar genius was naturally powerful. If she could become a soul formation true monarch in the future, she would be even more powerful. If that day really came, perhaps White Lotus could even become the most powerful soul formation true monarch in the history of the Kunlun party. But now, if she didn't succeed, then she didn't succeed. Right now, White Lotus was just a little girl whose cultivation was not as good as his. Zhuoxian's hand tightened. Intentionally or unintentionally, two of his fingers pressed on a certain pulse on White Lotus's fair wrist. White Lotus immediately let out a low cry. Half of her body went limp and at the same time, she was drenched in cold sweat. She angrily said, "Second senior brother, do you really want to help the evildoer?" Zhuoxian shook his head and said, "I'm doing this for your own good." *T. White Lotus scolded. "How can you be so hypocritical? You obviously want to use me to ask for rewards, but you insist on saying that it's for my own good. You do bad things and still want good things, and then add another one to make your heart feel better. Do you have any shame?" Zhuoxian lightly said, "You're young and insensible, so I won't argue with you. But you're losing your status by doing this, and you're too noisy. Junior sister, I'm being rude, so I can only temporarily seal your mouth." Before he finished speaking, Zhuoxian suddenly raised his head. It seemed that he had felt something at that moment. Immediately after, he heard a long and mournful cry from behind him. A huge dark shadow pounced on him. The wind was mournful, and the momentum was overwhelming. Zhuoxian was shocked. In desperation, he had to let go of White Lotus's hand. At the same time, he retreated several steps. His fingers were like knives, drawing an arc in front of him. A golden shield of light suddenly appeared, blocking in front of him and protecting his heart. With a loud bang, a huge black wolf appeared out of thin air. Its eyes were flickering with a dark light, and it was incomparably fierce. And at the other end, a hand suddenly stretched out from the side, grabbed White Lotus's hand, and dragged her to escape desperately. White Lotus fixed her eyes and saw that it was Lu Chen who appeared. At first, she was surprised, then happy, and then angry. White Lotus gritted her teeth and shouted, "Why did you run over and join in the fun?" Lu Chen glanced sideways while running. Although the atmosphere was tense, he still laughed and said, "You're so fierce, but aren't you still running very fast with me?" Chapter 258. I'm not stupid. White Lotus grumbled and ran even faster. After the two of them ran for a while, they heard a loud rumbling sound behind them. When they turned around, they saw a cloud of dust and stones flying everywhere. It was so loud that they couldn't even see the silhouettes of people clearly. After a while, they saw a black figure suddenly burrow out from the cloud of dust and ran wildly towards them. It was Atsu. From the cloud of dust behind Atsu, an angry roar was heard. Zhuoxian's figure soared into the sky, his eyes were bright and his face was filled with anger. His clothes were a little ragged, it seemed that he was caught off guard by the sneak attack and suffered a little loss. White Lotus was shocked and had a whole new level of respect for Atsu's combat power. One had to know that Zhuoxian was a veteran Jin Dan friar of the Kunlun party, and was also a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. His skills were not ordinary, it was far from what an ordinary Jin Dan friar could compare with. But even so, this giant wolf Atsu still caused him some trouble. It was obvious that after the night of the full moon, this holy beast Black Wolf seemed to have advanced by leaps and bounds in some aspects. But why couldn't she see it normally? White Lotus suddenly thought of this problem. In that split second, she felt that the black dog seemed to be hanging around Lu Chen all day, its lazy look was very deceptive. So this stupid dog was also treacherous and cunning, exactly like its master. Lu Chen suddenly felt a somewhat angry gaze coming from beside him. He looked at White Lotus strangely, but did not say anything. At this time, escaping was the most important thing. Zhuoxian had already seen them when he rushed into the sky, and was rushing towards them with a face full of killing intent. White Lotus was about to rush in the direction that Lu Chen had gone when her wrists suddenly slanted. She was grabbed by Lu Chen and ran in another direction, which was the Black Snake Forest. White Lotus was shocked at first because she realized that her wrist had been grabbed by Lu Chen and she had forgotten to shake it off. The second thing that surprised her was the direction that Lu Chen was running in. She could not help but exclaim, "Hey, are you crazy? That's the snake forest. Didn't you say that we can't go in or we'll die?" "I lied to you," Lu Chen said calmly to White Lotus as he ran. "Bastard, that person's skills are extremely high. We can't underestimate him. If we get entangled by him, we'll be in trouble." Lu Chen lowered his voice and said to White Lotus, "There's no other way. We can only take the risk and go to the snake forest. After we go in, listen to me. If you're really bitten to death by a snake, I won't be able to save you." White Lotus was shocked again. She stared at him and said, Hey, you just said that you lied to me. Why are you suddenly talking about people dying? Do you even speak the truth? Shut up and listen to me." Before she finished speaking, Lu Chen had already interrupted White Lotus's complaints. They only heard the sound of wind and their vision suddenly darkened. The two of them had rushed into the Black Snake Forest. It was dark in the forest. They could see the long hanging vines of different thicknesses everywhere. Behind them, whistling sounds could be heard. The closest one was Atsu. He ran very fast and had already caught up with them. Zhuoxian, who was a little further away, had an ashen face. He was running all the way and was quickly approaching them. The two people and a dog had just rushed into the snake forest when White Lotus's heart suddenly jumped. She saw that among the surrounding black vines, a few of them suddenly trembled slightly. They actually lifted up slightly, as if they were alive. Lu Chen didn't have the slightest intention of stopping to observe the surroundings. He directly pulled White Lotus and called for Atsu. They ran all the way into the forest. Wherever they passed, there was a lot of noise and movement. Thus, under White Lotus's shocked gaze, she saw that the surrounding countless vines of various sizes actually began to tremble slightly. Then, as if they were slowly coming to life, they began to slowly slide and stretch out on the strange dark brown tree trunks and branches. They really looked like countless dark snakes. No wonder this place was called the Snake Forest. A strange rustling sound that sounded like snakes and insects crawling began to come from all directions. The dark forest seemed to be startled and began to slowly wake up. Then, it emitted a kind of cold and evil aura that made people shiver from the bottom of their hearts. However, Lu Qin still ignored the movements around him. He still led White Lotus and Atsu all the way and rushed forward. The surrounding moving vines had already increased in number. There were even black vines suddenly hanging down from the sky, suddenly opening a terrifying big mouth to bite. The dark and terrifying spike seemed to be in the mouth, like the fangs of a giant snake. At this moment, White Lotus's face could be said to be pale. Looking at the countless black shadows swaying around them, it seemed like they would be drowned by the countless snakes in the next moment. And behind them, there were also a few angry roars. It was Zhuo Xian's voice. It seemed that he had also encountered a little trouble, as if he had fought with the strange vines in the forest. However, the most dangerous situation was of course still on Lu Chen's side. They ran in the thicker and thicker forest, and the situation also became more terrifying and dangerous. Seeing the hissing sound and the black clouds that filled the sky about to completely engulf them, White Lotus almost screamed. Lu Chen's eyes suddenly lit up. He pointed to the front and shouted, "Quick! Go over there." White Lotus looked up and was shocked again. She saw in the depths of the forest in front of her, suddenly a light lit up. It turned out to be a strange tree that was completely different from the surrounding black trees. It was silver-white all over, and its size was moderate. It looked like an ordinary person would need to hug it. At the same time, whether it was the trunk or the branches of this tree, there was not a single strange snake-like vine. A beautiful and dazzling light emitted from this silver-white strange tree. In this dark forest, it was like a maverick fairy, emitting an enchanting halo. At this moment, the black vines behind and around Lu Qin suddenly seemed to be completely enraged. The whistling sound instantly became several times louder. Countless vines began to grow wildly, flying in the air, and pouncing towards them. However, Lu Qin and White Lotus's movements were extremely fast. Without the slightest hesitation, they directly rushed towards the strange tree. At this moment, Black Wolf Atsu's speed also showed its amazing side at this moment. Only relying on his own strength, when he was running for his life, he actually surpassed Lu Qin and White Lotus in an instant. He easily passed in front of them and was the first to touch the bottom of the silver-white strange tree. Finally, Lu Qin and White Lotus managed to reach the silvery white tree by a hair's breadth before the terrifying black vines could reach them. Sure enough, within 6 feet of this strange tree, all the black vines suddenly stopped and did not go any further. Looking at the place not far away, the vines that were dancing and twisting wildly like giant snakes twisted their bodies. White Lotus felt a little scared. But soon, they found that the vines around them began to decrease rapidly. After looking around, they found that many of the black vines around here were like snakes, swimming towards the center of another fierce battle ahead. In that dark shadow, they could vaguely hear Zhuo Xian's howl getting louder and louder, and more angry. Not long after, there was a sudden howl from there, and a dazzling light burst out from Zhuo Xian's body. He had taken out an immortal sword magic weapon. The sword light was sharp, and it instantly cut off many vines around him. Suddenly, the pressure around them was relieved, and the originally extremely arrogant vines' offensive slowed down. However, this situation only lasted for a few breaths of time, and everyone only heard a sudden strange sound in the forest. All kinds of strange noises came one after another like snakes, insects, rats, and ants. Vines that were several times more than the ones that had been cut earlier came out of nowhere. Like a raging tide, they once again rushed towards Zhuo Xian with a momentum that was several times more powerful than before. They tore at him from all angles, as if they wanted to tear his enemy into pieces. Zhuo Xian was a little flustered for a moment. At the same time, at this critical moment, he suddenly felt a pain in his heart, and his spiritual power was a little sluggish. He was shocked at first, and then he only felt a chill in his heart because there were signs of poisoning in his body. In this forest, he didn't know where it came from, but it was actually filled with a poison that could poison cultivators. Zhuo Xian didn't dare to continue fighting. With a long howl, he rushed into the sky, sword light shooting out in all directions. With a few peng 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 sounds, he directly cut off the roots and vines above his head. Then, he rushed out of the forest, and flew into the air above his head. He didn't dare to stay for long, and directly flew into the distance. As for the mission to bring junior sister White Lotus home, he naturally couldn't care about it now. If he lost his life, what meaning would there be to those missions? In the dense forest, Lu Chen and White Lotus both witnessed Zhuo Xian's encounter, and at the same time, watched him flee. Bai Lian surveyed her surroundings and her expression changed slightly. She realized that the chaotic lands was indeed as dangerous and unpredictable as the legends said. This was only the outskirts of the chaotic lands, but there was already such a dangerous place. Not to mention ordinary people, even if a cultivator accidentally entered this forest, the slightest carelessness would most likely lead to eternal damnation. After calming down a little, White Lotus turned to Lu Chen and asked, "What should we do now?" No matter what, it was Lu Chen who brought her to this snake vine forest. Presumably, he also knew the secret of this forest, as well as the way to lead everyone out. However, after Lu Chen looked at her, he asked, "Do you recognize this tree?" The tree he was referring to was naturally the beautiful silver-white tree in front of them. White Lotus shook her head, indicating that she didn't know. This tree is called the snake vine tree. In fact, this entire forest actually exists for this tree. Chapter 259. You're saying that all these vines and strange trees are there to protect this snake vine tree? White Lotus asked in disbelief. Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's right. This kind of tree is inherently evil. Once a seed falls to the ground and germinates until it grows, it will gradually start to corrode and control the surrounding flowers and trees. Then it will all become what we see now." He pointed to the surrounding black forest and said, "The land around the mother tree is completely surrounded. Any person or beast that strays into this black forest will be attacked by these giant snake-like vines. Not to mention ordinary people, even cultivators with slightly weaker cultivation will often be bitten to death. As for other birds and beasts, there are also many that die here throughout the year." White Lotus's face was a little pale. After subconsciously looking around, she asked Lu Chen, "But when we rushed in just now, I don't think I saw any dead people or beasts' bones." Lu Chen looked at her as if he was looking at an idiot and said, "You don't think that these things only know how to kill and don't know how to eat, do you?" White Lotus didn't know why, but her body trembled a little. Her face showed a trace of a nauseous expression and said, "They actually eat." Lu Chen nodded and said, "This world is very cruel, isn't it?" The two of them turned together and looked at the strange silver-white tree in front of them. At this moment, in front of them, this strange tree seemed to be wrapped in a silver light. It looked brilliant, holy, and beautiful. It was breathtaking. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, perhaps it would be hard to imagine that there would be such a beautiful strange tree in this world. But what they didn't expect was that behind this beauty, there was a terrifying reality. White Lotus took a deep breath for a while and seemed to slowly calm down. But when she looked at the strange silver-white tree again, her eyes showed a look of disgust. She looked at the snake vine mother tree a few times and asked Lu Chen, "This is a little strange. Why did the vines not attack us after we got close to this tree?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said uncertainly, "I'm not too sure about this. This was probably the nature of the snake vine tree. But it's also possible that this strange tree is weak and doesn't dare to let these terrifying vines get too close. Otherwise, it might even be eaten." White Lotus was skeptical. She always felt that Lu Chen's words were a bit unreliable, but there seemed to be no better explanation now. She could only snort fiercely and said, "Why don't we cut down this tree to avoid harming people again?" Lu Chen laughed and said, "I couldn't tell that you actually have this kind of intention to eliminate evil for the people." White Lotus rolled her eyes at him. But even so, a beautiful girl rolling her eyes at him had an extra charm and beauty to it. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "Let's not cut it first. This snake vine tree should only grow in the chaotic lands. I've never heard of such a strange tree appearing in other places in the divine continent. It's probably because of the chaotic spiritual energy of the 5 elements in the chaotic lands that such a strange tree can be created. And according to what I know, once this snake vine mother tree dies or is seriously injured and loses control of the surrounding snake vines, the entire snake vine forest will go crazy and start to spread out and kill people. This will last for at least 6 to 7 days. If that's really the case, we won't be able to leave this place and will definitely die. After hearing this, White Lotus was not shocked but happy. She looked at Lu Chen and took a step forward and said, "What, could it be that you have a way to leave this place?" "It's alright, I have a rough idea." Lu Chen said, "But whether it will work or not, I'll have to try it out to know." As he said that, he slowly walked towards the silver tree. At the same time, a black light suddenly flashed in his hand and a black dagger appeared. It looked extremely sharp. This snake vine tree is very strange, and the surrounding vines are also very difficult to deal with. Even if ordinary cultivators cultivate to the level of Jean Dan Fryer, they will still have a headache in this snake vine forest. They won't be able to escape easily, let alone the foundation establishment and chi refining cultivators below. Lu Chen smiled faintly and said, "But in this place, there is a treasure on the snake vine tree that can help us." White Lotus said, "What is it?" "Tree sap." Lu Chen walked to the side of the snake vine tree and carefully looked at the trunk. Suddenly, he slashed down with his dagger. The black dagger was abnormally sharp, and it directly cut a large hole in the tree. After a while, a milky white sap flowed out of the wound. White Lotus walked over and looked at the sticky white tree sap that emitted a strange smell. She couldn't help but frown and asked Lu Chen, "What's the use of this tree sap?" Lu Chen said, "You can smear this tree sap on your face, hands, feet, and even your clothes. The surrounding vines will naturally recognize you as part of their roots and will not attack you." White Lotus let out an sound and was a bit hesitant. However, she saw that Lu Chen had already reached out to take the white tree sap and began to smear it on his body. Bai Lian's expression twisted. She glanced at Lu Chen, who was rubbing tree sap on her body and face, as if she could not bear to look straight at him. She asked, "Will this really work?" Lu Chen snorted and ignored her. He only said lightly, "It's up to you if you don't want to listen to me. However, if you are killed by the surrounding vines in the future, don't complain to me." White Lotus gritted her teeth and suddenly stomped her feet. She seemed to have made up her mind. She stared at Lu Chen and said, "If you dare to lie to me, I will definitely kill you after we get out of here." After saying that, White Lotus also used her hand to receive the milky tree sap and then directly smeared it on her face. Suddenly, a strange smell assailed her nose. Moreover, the smell was strong and strange. White Lotus almost vomited. However, not long after, a faint fragrance wafted out from the tree sap. It was very comfortable and quickly alleviated the choking smell from before. Not long after, the two of them smeared the snake vine tree sap all over their body. Other than the strange smell around them, the two of them looked like they were surrounded by white bubbles from head to toe. It looked very strange. White Lotus looked at Lu Chen's appearance and then looked down at her own body. Her face was very ugly. Lu Chen obviously didn't care about the appearance of these things. He even took some time to smear the white tree sap on Atsu's body. This time, Atsu looked very obedient and didn't resist at all. After everything was ready, Lu Chen and the others waited in the forest for a while. After confirming that the surroundings were very quiet, they tried to walk out of the forest. Lu Chen was the first to walk out. Atsu and White Lotus were behind him, watching carefully with their eyes wide open. The black vines were hanging not far away from them. The gloomy forest was so quiet that it seemed as if evil spirits were peeping at them. However, something surprising happened. After Lu Chen slowly took a few steps forward, the vines didn't attack him. White Lotus cheered and was greatly encouraged. Black Wolf Atsu, who didn't seem to understand what was going on, was still looking at Lu Chen with his eyes wide open. Lu Chen stood in the same place for a while, then tried to take another 7 or 8 steps forward. At this moment, his body was surrounded by the black snake vine. However, it was quiet around him. The snake vine didn't attack him at all. Obviously, this was because he smeared the white tree sap on his body. White Lotus and Atsu didn't hesitate anymore and left the snake vine. Under Lu Chen's lead, they began to walk out of the forest. Of course, they couldn't be returning along the same path. Although White Lotus wanted to go back and secretly check on Zhuo Xian's movements, Lu Chen didn't agree. After confirming the direction, they continued to walk in another direction. Which direction is that? White Lotus asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen's answer was also very simple. South. White Lotus frowned. Although I'm not familiar with the disorienting lands, I have a general idea of the situation here. If you go south, won't you be entering deeper and deeper into the disorienting lands? That means it's getting more and more dangerous. When the time comes, don't let the righteous and evil paths kill you before you die in the depths of the chaotic lands. Lu Chen smiled. It's no big deal. At worst, if I can't beat them, I'll just run. White Lotus snorted. It's not like every opportunity is so good. Previously, when my second senior brother came over, he wanted to bring me back to Kunlun Mountain. I felt that something was wrong and didn't want to go back. But if he finds me again, I'm afraid I won't be able to escape. I can't care so much. Lu Chen said. Let's get out of this sea of suffering first. All right. Two people and a dog began to walk south in the forest. At the same time, they carefully observed their surroundings. Other than the terrifying vines, they would occasionally raise their heads to look at the sky, probably afraid that Zhuo Xian would suddenly appear in the sky and discover their situation. However, Zhuo Xian did not know if he was injured in the snake-creeping forest, as he disappeared without a trace after leaving the forest. As time passed, Lu Chen, White Lotus, and Atsu's party finally walked out of the snake vine forest. Walking out of the dark and gloomy forest, they saw that their surroundings had once again returned to the blue sky, white clouds, green mountains, and clear waters. The two of them subconsciously let out a long sigh, as if they had released all the pent-up frustrations in their hearts. But it was at this moment that Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed. He saw that over 10 men in black had appeared in front of them. They slowly surrounded them and stared at him. Chapter 260. Black shirt and black trousers, a full set of attire, even his face was covered with a black scarf, revealing only his 2 eyes. Such attire was exactly the same as the evil sect assassin who sneak attacked Lu Chen and White Lotus not long ago. His background was obvious. White Lotus sucked in a breath of cold air, took a step back. At the same time she said in a low voice, I say, what enmity do you have with the evil sect? Could it be that you killed their parents and close friends? I can't believe he's so against you. Lu Chen's expression was indifferent, seemed to have no response to this question, only coldly looked at those black-attired men. Different from the black-attired men who rushed out to sneak attack before, this batch of black-attired men were mostly very quiet, did not make any sound of abuse, but the murderous aura around them was far stronger than before, and looking at the distance and position distribution between those people, they seemed to be in harmony with each other, disorderly and well-proportioned, actually sealed off all possible escape routes, firmly sealing Lu Chen and the rest here. Rustling sounds, footsteps were heard from time to time. The oppressive feeling that those black-attired men exuded had a kind of earth-shattering momentum, pressing over bit by bit. The corner of Lu Chen's eyes twitched slightly, suddenly clenched his teeth, quietly said, go back. White Lotus glanced at him, did not say anything, and the two of them once again slowly retreated back into that stretch of snake vine forest. Atsu also followed them back but looked a little more fidgety and uneasy, from time to time looked back, grimacing, revealing a ferocious look. Once again returning to that oppressive and gloomy forest, Lu Chen and White Lotus's expressions were very ugly. White Lotus even looked worriedly at that path. If those obviously powerful black-attired men rushed in, she and Lu Chen plus the 3 Atsu men, most likely it would be difficult to resist. However, to her surprise, the black-clothed men stopped outside the snake forest and did not continue to chase after her. White Lotus was surprised. She was about to say something to Lu Chen, but Lu Chen pulled her back to the side of the silver mother tree. At the same time, she heard Lu Chen say, "It's safer here, and it's easier to talk. The tree's sap will disperse with the wind, and after a while, its aura will weaken. At that time, the snake vines around us might attack us." "I see." Bai Lian nodded. However, she quickly furrowed her brows and began to size Lu Chen up with a strange look in her eyes. Lu Chen noticed her movements and asked, "What's wrong?" White Lotus thought about it and said, "I think you're a little strange." Lu Chen said, "What do you mean?" White Lotus stared at him and said, "Do you have any secrets in this snake forest that you haven't told me?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? There's no such thing." White Lotus's eyes were still bright as she stared at Lu Chen and said, "No, I think there's something wrong with you. According to what you said before, this snake forest is extremely dangerous, but it doesn't make sense that you're the only one in this world who knows the secret of this forest, right?" Lu Chen said, "Of course not. Although the snake forest is rare, as long as one walks in the chaotic lands often, there will be people who know about it." White Lotus said, "If that's the case, why are we able to walk freely in this snake forest, but why are the people outside, including my powerful second senior brother, so afraid of this forest?" Without waiting for Lu Chen to speak, White Lotus continued, "Also, among the people who are chasing after us, there are obviously cultivators with high cultivation. Why are we able to walk straight in and reach the snake vine mother tree so easily, but the others can't? Could it be that the snake vine mother tree sees us in a different light and thinks we're good people?" Lu Chen originally wanted to say something, but after hearing White Lotus's words, he suddenly closed his mouth and looked at this unusually beautiful girl in silence. A cold light flashed in his eyes. "I didn't notice these things before, but now that I think about it, I feel that something is wrong." White Lotus looked at Lu Chen with bright eyes and said, "I think you probably have some secret, a secret, that can make these fierce and powerful snake forests see us in a different light, right? What is it?" Lu Chen was silent for a long time, then suddenly sighed and said, "You're so smart and quick-witted, do your parents know about it?" "They died a long time ago, they don't know anything." White Lotus, as usual, had no respect for her parents. Her eyes only stared at Lu Chen and said, "You admit it? Just what kind of method can actually affect this snake forest? Tell me quickly." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Will you tell me why you learned those fierce methods and the secret blood-feeding method before you went to Kunlun Mountain?" White Lotus's expression didn't change, and she said calmly, "I had a fortuitous encounter when I was young, and met a strange person who passed on his mantle, so I learned some skills." Lu Chen looked at her and smiled, and said, "What a coincidence, I also met a master when I was young, and he taught me all kinds of killing and arson skills, so I have today." After saying that, he even added a sentence, and said with a smile, "That master was also a big fat man, with a body full of fat like a pig." White Lotus coldly snorted, and looked at Lu Chen with a somewhat unfriendly gaze. Obviously, she didn't believe even half a word that Lu Chen said. She sneered and said, "According to what you said, where is your heart of respect for your master? You actually dare to call your own master a pig, in the whole world?" Lu Chen laughed, but then after thinking about it, he actually nodded and said to White Lotus, "What you said is also right, in the whole world, probably only I dare to call him a pig." "Pay!" White Lotus spat, and said hatefully, "If you don't want to say it, then don't say it, who cares? What do we do now?" White Lotus asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen was silent, many thoughts turned in his mind, and he was thinking carefully. Previously in the various situations in this snake forest, in fact, what White Lotus said was indeed true. This little girl was indeed somewhat abnormal. At such a young age, not only was her talent amazing, even her intelligence and sharpness were difficult for ordinary people to match. In Lu Chen's body, there was indeed a secret that could affect the surrounding forest, causing the originally fierce and terrifying snake vines to often be a beat slower when they attacked, which allowed him and White Lotus to smoothly run to the mother tree. But of course, this method was not taught to him by true Lord Tian Lan in the past, nor was it a supernatural power that he learned in the evil sect, but was that seed. That mysterious seed embedded in his body, originated from the legendary Tree of God, which was passed down from ancient times in the evil sect. This Tree of God was the ancestor of all trees in the world, and the only bridge that connected the three worlds. However, in the more than 10 years that Lu Qin had obtained this seed, he had never felt any similar power from this seed. The greatest function of the Tree of God to him was to suppress the curse of the black fire, which allowed him to live until today. But the strange thing happened on the night of the full moon, when that earth-shattering pillar of light pierced through the heaven and earth. Lu Qin faintly felt that the seed in his body seemed to have some changes, and the ability to slightly influence and control some of the flowers and plants in the world was gradually discovered by Lu Qin on the road of escape after that. This was of course a great secret, and Lu Qin had no intention of telling White Lotus. In short, both of them had their own ulterior motives, and refused to reveal their own secrets, so they just laughed it off. But the predicament before them was still right in front of them, and Lu Qin also felt that it was a little tricky. The special ability of the Tree of God seed was only in a slightly awakened state. At most it could only slightly delay the attack speed of the surrounding snake vines, but when it came to wanting to control this snake vine forest, it was still too far away. But if they were to be trapped here, it was obviously not a long-term solution. Lu Qin frowned tightly, and just as his mind was turning rapidly, White Lotus asked again, "How about, we apply some more tree sap, and then escape from another direction? Anyway, this forest is so big, I don't believe that they can seal off all the exits." Lu Chen's expression looked a little solemn. He turned his head to look at the silver-white snake vine mother tree, and said, "This mother tree doesn't look very thick. It should have grown not long ago. We also can't take too much tree sap, or else we will hurt the roots of this mother tree, and will cause the surrounding snake vines to go crazy." White Lotus was shocked, and also looked at the snake vine mother tree, and said, "How many more times can we take tree sap?" Lu Qin calculated in his heart and said, "We need to apply it to 2 people at a time, and Ats's body is much bigger than ordinary people, so it needs a lot of tree sap. I think we can only take tree sap 1 more time at most." "Ah, only 1 chance?" White Lotus was a little surprised, and suddenly a look of hesitation appeared on her face. They could only take tree sap 1 more time. In other words, if they wanted to escape from this snake vine forest, it was almost the last chance they had left. This last time, they could only succeed, and not fail. If they failed, whether they were blocked by others, or the forest went crazy, perhaps only death would await them. Both of them fell silent and stood beside the snake vine mother tree in deep thought. Only Atu seemed to be more relaxed. He paced back and forth, and after a while, he suddenly strolled to the side of the snake vine mother tree. He looked at this beautiful silvery white mother tree from head to toe. He lifted his hind leg and peed on the roots of the tree. Lu Qin saw this scene, although he was anxious, but he couldn't help but find it funny, and thought, this dog Atsu was still a little different from the rest. But just as this thought flashed across his mind, his body suddenly shook, and he thought of the word different. Different, it really seemed to be a little different. His eyes suddenly changed, became a little deep, and at that moment, it seemed like his soul was also impacted by some kind of thought. Even his breathing became heavier. White Lotus felt it, and looked at Lu Qin, and asked, "What's wrong with you? Did you think of something?" Lu Qin was silent for a moment, and suddenly said, "Just now those black-attired people outside, you said they were evil cult killers?" Chapter 261. White Lotus was taken aback and said, "Isn't that so? It's exactly the same as those killers who came for you before." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, slowly shook his head and said, "It's not the same." White Lotus said, "What is it?" Lu Qin seemed to still be pondering, so even the speed of his speech was much slower than usual, but his tone was very calm and said, "They seem to be quite quiet." Bai Lian thought back to the black-clothed men she had seen outside the snake-overgrowth forest. As expected, most of the time, they did not speak. However, she quickly said in annoyance, "They're here to kill you, not to chat with you. Is it strange not to speak?" Lu Qin did not mind the sarcasm in White Lotus's words. After pondering for a moment said, "You don't understand, when those evil faction people see me, most of the time their eyes are red, even if some of them are calm and collected, but with so many people, it's impossible that all of them did not scold me." White Lotus laughed, pointed to Lu Chen and said, "You are so strange, are you born to be cheap? Others did not scold you, instead you feel uncomfortable." Lu Chen was not angry, only pondered alone and then slowly said, "No, now the more I think about it, the more I feel that there is something wrong with those people. Other than their reaction when they saw me, they also had a murderous aura, but the murderous aura did not seem to be particularly strong. You should still remember the imposing manner of those few evil faction killers who sneaked an attack on us." The last sentence, Lu Chen turned his head and asked White Lotus. White Lotus was stunned for a moment and said, After what you said, it seems that those few evil faction killers at the front were indeed more ferocious and agitated." Lu Chen squinted his eyes slightly and said, "Also, those black-attired men just now formed a formation together during the fight. This kind of fighting method is also not commonly seen in the evil faction. Most of the evil faction people are valiant in martial arts casting spells to fight, very few of them can form a formation to defend against the enemy at any time and place. This kind of method is more commonly." He suddenly stopped. White Lotus heard the important part and could not help but ask, "Who?" Lu Chen's expression became a little strange. After a while he calmly said, "Fuyunji. I've always found it strange. Why did I purposely choose a desolate and uninhabited path, even when I entered the chaotic land of chaos? Why did I choose a path that even I hadn't walked before? Logically speaking, no one should have been able to detect me in advance. But every time, the evil faction killers always seem to be able to catch up to us, and then launch a sneak attack, using all sorts of methods. But every time, the evil faction killers always seem to catch up." White Lotus's first reaction was to clear her name. Then she thought for a while and said, "Or it's because you have a deep grudge with the devil cult. They remember you and have some means to catch you. Well, for example, those sinister means of casting spells or something?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "I won't." White Lotus was a little unconvinced and said, "You know, again, the evil faction has been passed down for so many years, they have been fighting with the good faction for thousands of years and yet they have not fallen. Do you know what methods they have?" Lu Chen said, "I think I know a little." "You?" White Lotus suddenly found that she did not know what to say. In the end, she could only look at Lu Chen with disdain and said, "You only know how to brag." Lu Chen ignored her and lightly said, "If the evil faction really have this kind of method, they should have found me in these years. Since they couldn't find me, then there shouldn't be any special strange method that I don't know. On the other hand, Fuyunji." White Lotus saw that Lu Chen was suddenly in a daze, as if he was in a daze, couldn't help but pushed him and said, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" Lu Chen suddenly turned his head and stared at her. At the same time he raised his right hand, a black light flashed and that black dagger suddenly appeared in his palm. White Lotus's expression froze, stepped back and said, "What are you going to do?" Lu Chen looked at her, did not speak but did not have the intention to attack her. After a moment of silence, he suddenly walked a few steps to the side and then untied his upper clothes. White Lotus was somewhat surprised, did not know what Lu Chen was going to do. But whether it was her age or her current temperament, she did not care about the precaution between men and women, do not look at indecent things. Therefore she did not blush like some girls and cover her eyes and so on. Instead she looked straight at Lu Chen, trying to see clearly what Lu Chen was going to do. When Lu Chen untied his upper clothes, a relatively perfect man's flesh and blood body was revealed. Thanks to that mysterious seed of the god tree, he had soaked in that mysterious pond in the mysterious tree hole for 10 years to resist the curse of the black fire. An additional benefit was that the incomparably rich vitality in the water had erased most of the original scars on his body, almost giving him a perfect body. Now, no one knew that 10 years ago, his body was covered with innumerable scars of various sizes, each of which was a scar left behind by unerasable pain. Lu Chen's gaze swept across his body. After a moment, he raised the incomparably sharp black dagger with his right hand and calmly placed it on an extremely inconspicuous place below his left rib. Then, without changing his expression, he exerted a little force in his hand and the sharp blade immediately pierced into his flesh. White Lotus's expression changed a little, and the way she looked at Lu Chen seemed to have changed a little. And Lu Chen's expression also slightly twisted the moment the blade entered his body, as if he felt a trace of pain, but very quickly he calmed down again. He stared fixedly at the flesh under that seemingly perfect piece of skin. Suddenly, his wrist shook, a black light flickered, and the black dagger spun at an extremely fast speed. Without a sound, a small piece of flesh was cut off just like that. Fresh blood immediately gushed out, and was immediately pressed down by Lu Chen. But his attention was clearly not on his own wound, but on the small piece of flesh that originally belonged to him that had fallen on the ground. In the bloodstain, other than the dark red blood, there seemed to be a glimmer of light flashing past. A strange expression slowly appeared on Lu Chen's face. It seemed to be a sense of loss, but also an extremely deep disappointment. It was like a traveler who had walked a long road for his entire life, and when he finally reached the end, he discovered that he had walked on a dead end, and there was no more way to go. He slowly squatted down, and used the dagger in his hand to poke at the flesh on the ground. Within the bloody light, a small five-colored glyph slowly appeared. Although small, it was extremely fine. The lines of the glyph that were as thin as hair were abnormally clear, sketching out a complex and twisted glyph formation. At this time, White Lotus had unknowingly walked to his side. She also squatted down beside him, and softly asked, "What's wrong, what is this?" "This is the soul calming glyph." Lu Chen stared at the small glyph in the flesh on the ground, but even his voice was slightly different at this moment. It was no longer so calm, and there was some unnoticeable excitement. "This is an extremely profound secret technique of Zhengxian Meng Fuyunji. It is priceless, and the price is extremely high. Through this soul-calming glyph, they can know some of the secrets of the shadow, and can track their movements without anyone noticing." He looked at the piece of flesh, and after a while, he suddenly smiled, and said, "A long time ago, after the matter was done, someone told me that this thing was already useless, and that it was discarded." White Lotus also became silent. She did not have much understanding of Lu Chen's background and experiences, but after those words just now, she still faintly guessed some clues, and could roughly guess some things. She looked at the piece of soul-calming glyph. In the pool of blood, she could clearly feel that the glyph was flickering with a faint light, and spiritual power was flowing on it. It was clearly operating normally. If it was really discarded, this glyph should not have any reaction, and after such a long time, perhaps it had already become one with Lu Chen's flesh. So, she also had an inexplicable sense of absurdity and difficulty. After a while, she softly said, "You believe it?" "Yes, I believe it." Lu Chen said, and then laughed, and said softly, "So silly, right?" There was a strange silence in the dark forest for a long time. After a long time, White Lotus sighed, and said, "To be able to be jointly hated and schemed against by the world's good and evil forces, you are probably the first." The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched slightly, and then he took a deep breath, suddenly stood up, and began to put on his clothes again. As he turned around and took the first step, he directly crushed the soul-calming glyph. Resolute and decisive, without any hesitation. "The situation now is worse than I thought." Lu Chen walked in front of White Lotus and did not speak any nonsense. He looked into her eyes and said, "It's best if you don't stay with me. Otherwise, you might really die." White Lotus frowned and said, "I say, the way you speak, it always makes people feel a little uncomfortable. Why was it that when we thought it was the evil sect killers chasing after us, we joined hands to fight against the enemy, and escaped here without any fear, but once you know that the group of people standing outside now are from Fuyunji, you are afraid to this extent?" Lu Chen shook his head, and said, "I am not afraid, but sometimes, the trump card of us good faction people, is actually much stronger than those evil sect people who are struggling at death's door. When we do things, we also become more and more unscrupulous." Speaking till here, his mouth suddenly, tsk twice, and sneered, and said, "This is also thanks to a certain big fatty." White Lotus had yet to react, and asked in surprise, "What big fatty?" Lu Chen was just about to speak. Suddenly he heard a series of whistling sounds coming from the distance of the snake-overgrown forest, with a trace of surprise and panic. He indifferently glanced at the already broken glyph, and then said to White Lotus, "Let's go, they probably found out." Chapter 262. When they cut open the snake vine mother tree for the second time to extract the sap, White Lotus specially observed this silvery white and abnormally beautiful mother tree. As expected, as the sap flowed out, the halo of the snake vine mother tree seemed to have dimmed a lot. And when they smeared the sap on their bodies again, the luster of the snake vine mother tree was already on the verge of collapse. Obviously, the situation was just as Lu Chen had said before. They only had one last chance. Lu Chen glanced at the snake vine mother tree, and his expression didn't change much. He directly walked out. Atsu followed behind him, and White Lotus hesitated for a moment, but also followed. "You're still following me?" Lu Chen didn't look back, but his voice could still be clearly heard. "You really don't want to live anymore?" White Lotus looked at his back and said, "Tell me the secret of the blood food on Atsu's body, and I'll leave immediately." Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment, then he turned his head, and a strange and complicated expression appeared on his face. He said, "I let you go because I'm worried that you'll be in danger if you follow me. I'm afraid that I'll harm your life. This is my kindness to you. But why do I feel like you're using my kindness to threaten me?" White Lotus thought for a moment, but nodded and said, "That seems to be the case." Lu Chen said indifferently, "Do you think that good people are easy to bully? I sympathize with you and think for your sake, so you deserve to be threatened and bullied?" White Lotus remained silent. Lu Chen shook his head and said, "There's no such logic in this world." White Lotus walked to his side. She wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she sighed and said, "I said the wrong thing. But I still want to say that even if there's no such logic in this world, there are many such things in this world." This time, it was Lu Chen's turn to fall silent. A long while later, he softly sighed and said, "Therefore, I will not be a good person." In the end, Lu Chen and White Lotus were separated in this snake-overgrown forest. White Lotus didn't feel that her relationship with this man had reached the point of life and death, nor did she have the intention to go on a dangerous journey with him. Lu Chen also didn't reveal any secrets to White Lotus until they parted ways. When they parted ways in the deep and dark snake forest, White Lotus asked Lu Chen if they would have a chance to meet again. Lu Chen shook his head. White Lotus looked at him and said, "Are you resigned to your fate and don't intend to come back alive?" Lu Chen knew that was not what he meant. Who knew what would happen in the future? "If fate allows it, let's meet again in the future." After saying these words, they brushed past each other and walked in an unknown direction. After walking for a while, Bai Lian turned back to look. She could see the figure of the man walking away from her. Beside him was the giant black wolf, as if it was the only companion he had in his life. White Lotus chose a path towards the northeast. Just like the places she had passed before, the snake-overgrown forest was filled with black hanging vines. They hung on the seemingly omnipresent black trees like giant sleeping snakes. White Lotus had seen how terrifying these giant snakes were once they woke up not long ago. Thinking of what Lu Chen meant when he said that this forest would eat things, she couldn't help but feel a chill down her spine even though she was extremely brave. However, after smearing the snake-overgrown mother tree's tree sap on her body, the vines remained very calm. They did not have any intention of attacking her. Just like that, White Lotus walked out of the snake-overgrown forest without any mishaps. When she reached the edge of the snake-overgrown forest, White Lotus deliberately looked out. There was no movement in the surroundings, especially when the murderous men in black from before did not appear here. This allowed her to heave a sigh of relief, and then she swiftly walked over. However, she'd only walked around 3 m out of the forest when something flashed before her eyes. A black-clothed figure flashed out from behind a hill at the side, and he held an immortal sword and directly obstructed her path. White Lotus's face darkened. She focused her attention and took precautions. However, the man in black did not seem to have any intention of attacking her. He only glanced at her and a hint of surprise flashed through his eyes. He seemed to be slightly surprised at White Lotus's young age. "Young lady, where's your companion from before?" the man in black asked. His expression was actually not very stern. White Lotus snorted and did not reply. Instead, she glanced left and right, looking like she was looking for an opportunity to escape. The man in black's gaze immediately sharpened. He frowned and said, "Don't make things difficult for yourself. You'd better hurry up." Before he could finish speaking, White Lotus's figure suddenly flashed, and she had already flown to the side. The man in black was furious. He extended his hand and grabbed. The hand seemed to be far away, but suddenly, it seemed to have used some kind of ability and suddenly grew several times its original size. It seemed to grow with the wind and directly grabbed White Lotus's back. White Lotus's body suddenly sank in midair. Her entire body suddenly landed on the ground, and then she turned around. Instantly, a layer of frost and snow drifted in front of her. With a few cracking sounds, the strange hand was actually frozen. The man in black in the distance made a sound of surprise, and his gaze towards White Lotus immediately became slightly different. The black hand shook a few times, shaking off the surrounding ice and snow, and at the same time, it shrank back. White Lotus took the opportunity to continue flying, but at this moment, she suddenly heard a whistling sound behind her. The sound seemed to be piercing through the air, and she could not help but feel her heart skip a beat. She subconsciously looked back, and her face immediately paled. The immortal sword in the black-robed man's hand glowed brightly and emitted a dazzling azure light. One split into two, two into three, and in an instant, there were actually 50 to 60 dazzling azure lights that were around 5 feet in length. They formed an incomparably fierce azure sword formation that covered the heavens and the earth as it rushed over. The sword formation was extremely powerful, and in an instant, it surrounded White Lotus and directly slashed down. White Lotus was greatly shocked, retreated a few steps and used all her strength to dodge, but she still could not escape from the range of this magnificent sword formation. Instead, she was quickly forced to a dead end, seeing that the tens of green lights were about to land and pierce through her body. At that moment, a wave of despair surged in White Lotus's heart. At the same time, she was also bewildered. This person's cultivation was obviously extremely high, he was definitely not an ordinary person. What was his identity and background? Right at this critical moment, a long howl suddenly sounded out, and then a brilliant golden light descended from the sky. It spun rapidly in mid-air, and there was actually the sound of thunder in the sky. It was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, and it suddenly fell into the green light sword formation. The green light first sank and then it actually expanded against the trend, and instead rolled up and pounced towards that golden light. A figure appeared from the golden light. It was Zhuoxian. However, at this moment, Zhuoxian's expression was extremely solemn. He looked at the man in black in front of him, and with a shake of his wrist, the golden light shone brightly again, but it transformed into a dazzling golden wheel in mid-air, rumbling as it rotated, and met the green light head-on. The golden and azure immortal lights collided with each other without any finesse. There was a loud bang, and the shockwaves rose and fell. White Lotus only felt a roar in her ears. She took a few steps back, her head still ringing. The golden and green lights slowly retracted, and in mid-air, Zhuoxian and the man in black hovered in mid-air, facing each other. After a moment, Zhuoxian took a deep breath, and was the first to put away the magic treasure in his hand. He cupped his hands and said, "Thousand Extremes dark green sword, which senior brother of the Thousand Extremes sect are you?" The man in black stared at Zhuoxian's face, and after a moment, he nodded slightly. With a wave of his hand, the sky full of green lights also fell and dissipated, turning back into an immortal sword and returning to the sword box on his back. Then, he reached out and took off the black cloth on his face, revealing the face of a man with thick eyebrows and a square face. He looked to be about 30 years old, and he had a calm bearing. He said, "I am Ho Zhenglong of the Thousand Extremes sect. Your golden arc wheel is also impressive. Could it be that you are from the Kunlun sect?" Zhuo Xian said, I am Zhuo Xian of the Kunlun party. Hou Zhenglong frowned slightly, and after a moment of thought, a trace of surprise suddenly appeared on his face. He said, could it be that you are Zhuo Xian, senior brother Zhuo of the Hakushin Jinkun sect? Zhuo Xian said, that's me. The Thousand Extremes sect was not a small sect, but one of the 5 famous sects of Zhengxianmeng that were on par with the Kunlun sect. There were countless experts and cultivators in the sect. Before today, Zhuo Xian had never heard of Hou Zhenglong, but just based on the Thousand Extremes dark green sword he had just used, his momentum was vigorous, sharp, and steady. When he attacked, it was like a storm, and when he retreated, it was like a whale sucking in water. He could go up and stop at will, so it was obvious that this person's cultivation was very high, and his foundation was very solid. He must be an outstanding talent that appeared in the Thousand Extremes sect in recent years. Hou Zhenglong also seemed to be very respectful towards Zhuo Xian, but the look in his eyes seemed a little strange. Zhuo Xian had a rough idea in his heart. It had been some time since the night of the full moon, and the news of Hakushin Jinkuan's death should have spread, so it would not be strange if Hou Zhenglong knew about it. However, of course, he would not tell Hou Zhenglong about these things, but after sizing up Hou Zhenglong's attire, he frowned and said, Brother Hou, your attire seems to be... Hou Zhenglong laughed and said, I won't hide it from Zhuo Shixiang, right now I'm working for the Floating Clouds division of the True Immortal Alliance. Right now, I'm working with the brothers in my division to do something big. My disguise is to disguise as a demon from the evil cult. Zhuo Xian suddenly understood, nodded and said, I see. Hou Zhenglong laughed, and then his gaze fell on White Lotus who was standing beside Zhuo Xian, and then his expression turned serious, pointed at White Lotus and said, Brother Zhuo, may I ask when you saved this little girl just now, do you know her identity? Zhuo Xian nodded and said, yes, her name is White Lotus, and she is my junior sister. If I have offended you in any way, please forgive me Brother Hou. Hou Zhenglong was stunned for a moment, and said in astonishment, she is your junior sister, then she is also Hakushin Jinkuan's disciple. Zhuo Xian hesitated for a moment, and said, yes, junior sister is my teacher's last disciple. Hou Zhenglong frowned, looked at White Lotus, and his face suddenly darkened, and said, that is strange, may I ask why your junior sister was with that devil sect demon before? Chapter 263. Evil sect evil person. Zhuo Xian was obviously taken aback, turned to look at White Lotus, at the same time said, it can't be. Junior sister, is what he said true? White Lotus snorted, then said neatly, it's fake. Zhuo Xian frowned and raised his head to look at Hou Zhenglong. Hou Zhenglong's expression was calm as he looked at White Lotus and said, when you first came out of the snake forest, you were following that evil cult demon. I didn't lie about that, did I? White Lotus said, I am with that person, but he is not the evildoer of the evil cult. These words of hers were said with incomparable firmness, with an air of decisiveness that could sever nails and chop iron. Hou Zhenglong was stunned for a moment, and Zhuo Xian also pondered for a moment, cupped his hands and said to Hou Zhenglong, Hou brother, my junior sister is talented and intelligent, deeply favored by my teacher Hakushin Jinkuan, her family background is also excellent, so in terms of sentiment or reason, it is indeed impossible for her to be evil sect people. There must be some misunderstanding before. Hou Zhenglong obviously had some respect or fear for Zhuo Xian's identity, and in addition, Zhuo Xian's words were indeed reasonable. For a moment he could not help but hesitate, muttered, but that person is also evil sect. Who said he is evil sect people? White Lotus suddenly said loudly, have you seen the evil sect people who were chased for thousands of miles by a large group of evil sect people, running for their lives all day? Hou Zhenglong was shocked, said, evil sect people are also chasing that person. White Lotus said, yes, I was almost killed previously, luckily Lu Chen saved me. Hou Zhenglong frowned, a glimmer flashed deep in his eyes, seemed to be thinking about something. And Zhuo Xian looked at him, coughed, said, Hou brother, I think what junior sister said may be somewhat reasonable. But right now I have something important to do, I need to bring junior sister back to Kunlun Mountain as soon as possible, I will take my leave first. Hou Zhenglong hesitated for a moment before he nodded slowly and cupped his hands together. If that's the case, please do as you wish, senior brother Joie. Xian nodded and then reached out to grab White Lotus's wrist. White Lotus subconsciously struggled, but in the end, she still sighed and obediently followed Xian. Ho Zhenglong's brows furrowed tightly as he watched the two of them leave. It was as if there was something he could not figure out. After a long time, he muttered to himself, "This doesn't seem right." Xian brought White Lotus away from Ho Zhenglong's place. After walking for a while, Xian stopped, one hand still holding White Lotus's wrist, at the same time his other hand took out a glowing oddly shaped talisman from his bosom. When White Lotus saw that talisman, her face suddenly changed, her body struggled but Xian's hand that was holding her wrist exerted force. White Lotus suddenly groaned in pain, her body went limp. Then Xian stretched out his hand and stuck that talisman on the back of White Lotus's waist. That talisman suddenly lit up, transformed into several silver lights that wandered on White Lotus's body, like a silver snake raising its head, and also like lightning trembling. At that moment, White Lotus's face was reflected in silver. After a moment, these silver lights disappeared into her body. White Lotus's body shook, her face became pale, but there was anger in her eyes. She stared at Xian and sneered, "Second senior brother, your cultivation is so much higher than mine, but you still use such a rare thing like the Forbidden Spirit Talisman, to suppress my cultivation. This is too superfluous." Xian was silent for a moment, then gently let go of White Lotus's wrist and said, "Little junior sister, I have no evil intentions towards you. It's just that you are too young and the world outside the mountain gate is too dangerous for you. I have no choice but to bring you back to the mountain. I did this because I was afraid of hurting you." White Lotus sneered, obviously she did not believe Xian's words. Xian did not care and just said, "You will understand in the future. Let's go back to the mountain." White Lotus secretly used her qi several times, but it was repeatedly interrupted in her Dantian's qi si. She could not use her spiritual power to activate various magical powers. It was obvious that she was restricted by the magical Forbidden Spirit Talisman. She gritted her teeth and walked forward as if she had accepted her fate. Xian followed behind her for a few steps and asked, "Little junior sister, before that 1,000 Extremes Sex Ho senior brother said that you were with that person. That person is really not from the evil faction?" "I said he is not," White Lotus said snappily. Xian nodded and said, "Then where did he go now?" "How would I know? Anyway, he went in the opposite direction after separating from me." White Lotus suddenly became vigilant. She looked at Xian and said, "Why are you asking this?" Xian smiled and said gently, "Don't be afraid. I'm just casually asking. My priority now is to escort you back to Kunlun Mountain. I don't care about anything else." White Lotus's expression relaxed a little. She snorted and continued to walk forward. Xian's footsteps slowed down a little. He looked to the side and saw that behind a forest several feet away, a figure had quietly appeared. It was He. He nodded at Xian from afar. His face didn't show much expression. He turned around and left. The direction he walked in was the opposite direction of Xian and White Lotus. Xian stared at He's back for a moment. Then he stepped forward and caught up with White Lotus. "Second senior brother." White Lotus suddenly called out. Xian responded and said, "What's wrong? When Master died, what did he look like?" Xian's body shook slightly. After a moment of silence, he said softly, "I didn't see it with my own eyes. I don't know. A deity transformation stage lord died just like that." White Lotus' face, which still carried a trace of childishness, suddenly became a little sad, and said, "Even if we cultivate for the rest of our lives, it's hard to say whether we can reach Master's realm, not to mention the higher realm of immortality. Second senior brother, tell me, why do we have to work so hard to cultivate?" Xian was silent for a long time. He said, "You're so young. Why do you think so much?" White Lotus said, "It's natural. Haven't you thought about this, second senior brother?" Zhuoxian smiled and said softly, I have thought about it. I have thought about it many, many times. Lu Chen walked in the opposite direction of White Lotus. He was probably heading southwest. In short, he was trying his best to avoid those men in black, no matter who they were. While walking in the forest, Lu Chen didn't speak for a while. He remained silent. Atsu followed beside him. He seemed to feel something was wrong and looked up at him from time to time. I'm fine. Lu Chen said to Atsu, but if I'm really found by them and I have nowhere to run, what will you do, Atsu? Atsu tilted his head as if he was thinking. Lu Chen praised and said, you actually know how to think now. You're not so stupid after advancing. Woof woof. Atsu barked. Lu Chen grinned and said, looking at your mighty and majestic appearance, it's really funny to suddenly bark like a dog. As he said that, he reached out and hugged Atsu's neck. Atsu stuck out his tongue and licked his face. It felt a little warm. If I really can't do it, you can run by yourself. Lu Chen leaned against Atsu's huge head and suddenly said softly. Atsu didn't respond. Lu Chen didn't know whether he understood or not. Lu Chen didn't say much. After a while, he suddenly sneered and said, Requiem Talisman, Requiem Talisman. Do you know what Requiem means? Atsu turned his head and looked at him. They probably have long forgotten the meaning of these two words. He glanced at the sky and said lightly. At this moment, in front of him, there was a line of light that slowly lit up. Not far away was the edge of the snake forest. It was quiet inside and outside the forest. It looked cold and desolate. The scenery in this direction was completely different from the place where he first came out. There were many trees before, but in the southwest direction, there were many stones and hills. Further away, there was a mountain range. Lu Chen hid at the edge of the forest and secretly peeped outside for a while. There was no movement in the surroundings, but he didn't dare to be careless. His eyes were bright, and he continued to look left and right. After a while, he looked at the mountain range in the distance. He saw that the mountain was tall, but the shape of the mountain range was a little strange. It was shaped like a giant rat. From afar, the mountain was rugged and had many cracks. Only a few places had green trees. Most of the mountains were barren and cracked. Lu Chen's heart moved. He thought about a mountain that he had heard of before. It was similar to the mountain in front of him. It was called Rat Hill. The Rat Mound Mountain was an extremely dangerous place. The most frightening thing about it was that the Cloud Earth Rat, a demonic beast unique to this place, lived in the mountain. Its body was as big as a domestic dog, and it had sharp teeth and crimson eyes. It often lived in groups in the huge underground crevices of the Rat Mound Mountain, and its temperament was exceptionally cruel and bloodthirsty. However, after crossing Rat Hill and heading south, there was another place called Evil Python Valley. Although it was called a valley, it was actually a precipitous cliff. The cliff was steep and vertical, as if it had been carved out by a god's axe. There were many poisonous snakes in the Evil Python Valley, especially a kind of scarlet python. It was also one of the most powerful demon beasts in the outer regions of the chaotic lands. Over the years, it had taken the lives of countless cultivators. The Rat Mound Mountain and the Evil Python Valley were practically connected and were both extremely dangerous places. However, as long as they crossed over these two mountains and headed south, they would almost reach the boundary between the central and outer regions of the chaotic lands, the River Dragon River. The world was big. Even in such a chaotic and vast land like the chaotic lands, Lu Chen always felt like he had no place to stand. This kind of feeling was very bad. It made people very nervous and easily angered. However, in order to survive, perhaps he could only continue to flee like this. Whether it was the devil cult or Fuyunji, their sphere of influence could only extend as far as the north bank of the Dragon River. Any further into the chaotic lands was no longer a place that they could control. If he wanted to survive, he could only go to the Dragon River. Lu Chen took a deep breath and walked out of the snake forest.